Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. 1. Goethe Prometheus, 1749 to 1775. 1. Growth. From the time when he trod the streets of Frankfurt am Main as consciously the grandson of its mayor, to his septuagenarian years when his casual conversation made the renown of his Boswell Eckermann, ran a full gamut of experience, absorbing all that life, love, and letters could give him, and returning it gratefully in wisdom and art. Frankfurt was a free city, dominated by merchants and fairs, but also the imperially designated seat for the coronation of German kings and Holy Roman emperors. In 1749 it contained 33,000 souls, nearly all pious, well-behaved, and gemütlich. Goethe's birthplace was a substantial four-story house, destroyed by fire in 1944, rebuilt in 1951. His father, Johann Caspar Goethe, was the son of a prosperous tailor and innkeeper. He ruined his political career by pride and arrogance, and retired from the practice of law to a life of amateur scholarship in his elegant library. In 1748 he married Katharina Elisabeth, daughter of Johann Wolfgang Textor, Schultheiss, or Bürgermeister, of Frankfurt. Her son never forgot that through her he belonged to the untitled patriciate that had ruled the city for generations. When he was 78, he told Eckermann, "We Frankfurt patricians always considered ourselves equal to the nobility, and when I held in my hands the diploma of nobility, granted him in 1782, I had nothing more, in my own opinion, than I had possessed long ago." He felt that nur die Lumpe sind bescheiden. Only rascals are modest. He was the eldest of 6 children, of whom only he and his sister Cornelia survived childhood. In those days much parentage was love's labor lost. It was not a happy household. The mother was of a kindly nature, inclined to humor and poetry, but the father was a pedantic disciplinarian who alienated his offspring by the harshness and impatience of his temper. With my father, Goethe recalled, there could be no pleasant relation. From him, as well as from experience as a privy councillor, Goethe may have derived something of the stiffness that showed in his later life. From his mother he may have taken his poetic spirit and his love of the drama. She built a marionette theatre in her home. Her son never recovered from its fascination. The children received their first education from their father, then from tutors. Wolfgang acquired a reading knowledge of Latin, Greek, and English, some Hebrew, and the ability to speak French and Italian. He learned to play the harpsichord and the violoncello, to sketch and paint, to ride and fence and dance. But he took life as his best teacher. He explored all quarters of Frankfurt, including the Judengasse. He ogled the pretty Jewish girls, visited a Jewish school, attended a circumcision, formed some notion of Jewish holy days. The Frankfurt fairs, by bringing into the city exotic faces and goods, added to his education. So did the French officers in the Goethe home during the 7 Years' War. In 1764, the 15-year-old boy saw the coronation of Joseph II as King of the Romans. He sucked in every bit of it, and spent 20 pages describing it in his autobiography. At 14, he had the first of the many love affairs that engendered half of his poetry. He had already won a reputation for his facility in writing verses. Some boys with whom he occasionally mingled asked him to compose a poetic letter in the style of a girl to a youth. He did so well that they had it delivered to a lovelorn member of the group as coming from the object of his devotion. This lad wished to answer in kind, but lacked wit and rhymes. Would Goethe compose a reply for him? Goethe consented, and in gratitude the lover paid the expenses of an outing for the group to a suburban inn. The waitress was a lass in her teens, called Margareta, Gretchen for short. Goethe gave that name to the heroine of Faust. Perhaps because of the romances he had read and the letters he had written, he was in a mood to appreciate the charm of girlhood. "The first propensities to love in an uncorrupted youth," he wrote at 60, "take altogether a spiritual direction. Nature seems to desire that one sex may by the senses perceive goodness and beauty in the other. And so by the sight of this girl and by my strong inclination for her, a new world of the beautiful and the excellent was revealed to me." He never lost that world, One woman after another stirred his sensitive spirit, almost always with reverence as well as desire. At the age of 73, he fell in love with a girl of 17. For a while he was too awed to speak to the charmer. I went to church for love of her, and during the long Protestant service I gazed my fill at her. He saw her again at her inn, seated, like another Gretchen, at a spinning-wheel. Now she took the initiative and gaily signed the second love letter that he had fabricated as from a girl. Then one of the group, whom Goethe had recommended to his grandfather, was caught falsifying bonds and wills. Wolfgang's parents forbade him further association with those boys. Gretchen moved to a distant town, and Goethe never saw her again. He was much put out when he learned that she had said, "I always treated him as a child." He was quite content now, in 1765, to leave Frankfurt and study law at the University of Leipzig. Like any eager youth, he read widely outside of his assigned subjects. He had already, in his father's library, browsed in Bayle's Dictionnaire historique et critique, with much damage to his religious faith. And as soon as I reached Leipzig, I tried to free myself altogether from my connection with the church. For a time he delved into mysticism, alchemy, even magic. This, too, entered Faust. He tried his hand at etching and woodcuts, studied the picture collection at Dresden, frequently visited the painter Oeser in Leipzig. Through Oeser he became acquainted with the writings of Winckelmann. Through these and Lessing's Laocoon, he received his first infusions of reverence for the classic style. He and other students were preparing a hearty reception for Winckelmann at Leipzig in 1768, when the news came that Winckelmann had been murdered in Trieste. The sense of beauty was predominant in his approach to the world. In religion he liked only its colorful and dramatic sacraments. He did not care for philosophy as written by philosophers, except Spinoza. He shuddered at logic and fled from Kant. He loved drama, wrote a worthless one at Leipzig, and composed poetry almost every day, even while listening to lectures on law. The poems, which he published as Das Leipziger Liederbuch, are in the style of Anacreon, playful, sometimes erotic. Yet I'm content and full of joy, if she'll but grant her smile so sweet, or if at table she'll employ to pillow hers, her lover's feet. Give me the apple that she bit, the glass from which she drank bestow, and when my kiss so orders it, her bosom, veiled till then, will show. Was this merely wishful thinking? Apparently not. He had found in Leipzig a pretty head, Annette Schönkopf, who was willing to enter at least the vestibule of love. She was the daughter of a wine merchant who served a midday meal to students. Goethe ate there frequently and fell in desire with her. She returned his ardor with judicious reserve and allowed other men to be attentive to her. He grew jealous and took to spying on her. They quarreled and made up, quarreled and made up, quarreled and parted. Even in these ecstasies he reminded himself that he was the grandson of a burgomeister, and that he had in him a daimon, the urge and drive of an omnivorous genius that demanded freedom for its full development to its own imperative destiny. Annette accepted another suitor. Goethe counted this a defeat and tried to forget it in dissipation. I had lost her really, and the frenzy with which I revenged my fault upon myself by assaulting in various frantic ways my physical nature, in order to inflict some hurt on my moral nature, contributed very much to the bodily maladies under which I lost some of the best years of my life. He sank into melancholy, suffered from nervous indigestion, developed a painful tumor in the neck, and woke up one night with an almost fatal hemorrhage. He left Leipzig without taking his degree, and returned to Frankfurt in September 1768 to face paternal reproofs and maternal love. During his long convalescence he made the acquaintance of Susanna von Klettenberg, an ailing, kindly Moravian pietist. Her serenity and peace of mind never left her. She looked upon her sickness as a necessary element of her transient earthly existence. He described her, years later, with sympathy and skill, in the Confessions of a Beautiful Soul, which he inserted into Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre. but he recorded very debonairly her claims that his nervousness and melancholy were due to his failure to reconcile himself to God. Now I had believed from my youth upward that I stood on very good terms with my God. Nay, I even fancied that he might be in arrears to me, as I was daring enough to think that I had something to forgive him. This presumption was grounded on my infinite goodwill, to which, it seemed to me, he should have given better assistance. It may be imagined how often I got into disputes on this subject with my friends, which, however, always terminated in the friendliest way. Nevertheless, he experienced stray moments of piety, even to attending some sessions of the Moravian Brethren, but he was repelled by the mediocre intelligence of these simple people, and soon returned to his casual combination of pantheistic faith and rationalistic doubt. In April 1770 he departed for Strasbourg, hoping to get his law degree. A fellow student described him, then 21, as a handsome figure with a magnificent forehead and great flashing eyes, but added, all would not be smooth sailing with this young man, for he seemed to have a wild and unsettled air. Perhaps his long illness had unnerved him. His daimon was too unsettling to let him gain stability. But what youth with fire coursing in his blood can enjoy repose? When he stood before the great cathedral, he hailed it patriotically as not Catholic, but German architecture, our architecture, for the Italians can boast of none like it, still less the French. He had not yet seen Italy or France. Alone I climbed to the highest peak of the tower, and ventured at that elevation to step out on a platform which measured scarcely a square yard. I inflicted this terror and torture upon myself so many times until the experience became a matter of indifference to me. One of his professors noted that Herr Goethe behaved himself in a way which caused him to be regarded as a meretricious pretender to scholarship, a frantic opponent of all religious teaching. It was the well-nigh universal opinion that he had a slate loose in the upper story. A dozen new experiences served to feed his flame. He met Herder several times during the latter's stay in Strasbourg. Herder, 5 years older, dominated these encounters. Goethe, in a modest interlude, called himself a planet revolving around Herder's sun. He was disturbed by Herder's dictatorial tendency, but was stimulated by him to read old ballads, Macpherson's Ocean, and, in Wieland's translation, Shakespeare. But also he read Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot. Besides pursuing his work in law, he took courses in chemistry, anatomy, obstetrics, and he continued his study of women. He felt their charm with all the keen sensitivity of a poet, all the electric incandescence of youth. 47 years later he told Eckermann that he believed in a mysterious magnetic effect of one person upon another, and most of all through difference of sex. He was stirred by the light and prancing walk of girls, by the music of their voices and laughter, by the color and rustle of their dress, and he envied the intimacy of the flower they sometimes wore in their corsage or their hair. One after another of these magic creatures, called to his blood, grew in his imagination and moved his pen. There had already been Gretchen and Annetta, soon there would be Lotte and Lily and Charlotte, later Minna and Ulrike. But now at Sesenheim, near Strasbourg, there was the most appealing of them all, Friederike Brion. She was the younger daughter, 19 in 1771, of the town pastor, whom Goethe compared to Goldsmith's virtuous vicar of Wakefield. The pages about Friederike in Goethe's autobiography are the finest prose he ever wrote. Several times he rode out from Strasbourg to enjoy the unspoiled simplicity of this rural family. He took Friederike for long walks, for she was most at home in the open air. She fell in love with him and gave him all that he asked. In a lonely place in the forest we embraced each other with deep emotion, and gave each other the most faithful assurance that each loved the other from the bottom of the heart. Soon he was confessing to a friend that one is not happier by a hair's breadth by attaining the object of his wishes. Meanwhile he was writing in Latin his doctoral thesis, which affirmed, like Febronius, the right of the state to be independent of the Church. It won the approval of the university faculty. He passed the examinations, and on August 6, 1771, he received his degree as a licentiate at law. The time had come to leave Strasbourg. He rode out to Sesenheim to say goodbye to Friederike. When from my horse I reached her my hand, the tears stood in her eyes, and I felt very uneasy. Having at last escaped the excitement of a farewell, I, in a quiet and peaceful journey, pretty well regained my self-possession. Remorse came later. Gretchen had been taken away from me, Annetta had left me. Now for the first time I was guilty. I had wounded the most lovely heart to its very depths. And the period of a gloomy repentance, with the absence of a refreshing love, to which I had become accustomed, was most agonizing. It is sadly self-centered, but which of us, in the trial and error of love, has not wounded one or two hearts before winning one? Friederike died unmarried, April 3, 1813. 2. Goethe and Werther. In Frankfurt, the new licentiate grudgingly practiced law. He visited Darmstadt occasionally and felt the influence of its cult of sentiment. He was now in a strong reaction against France, against French drama and its rigid rules, even against Voltaire. More and more he relished Shakespeare, who had put the nature of man, lawful or lawless, upon the stage. In this mood and in the exuberant vigor of youth he was ripe for Sturm und Drang. He sympathized with its rejection of authority, its exaltation of instinct over intellect, of the heroic individual over the tradition-imprisoned masses. And so, in 1772-73, he wrote Goethe von Berlichingen. It was a remarkable performance for a lad of 23, a drama uniting war, love, and treachery in a story warm with zeal for liberty, exuding vitality, and holding the interest from beginning to end. Goethe was a knight whose right hand had been shot off in battle when he was 24, in 1504. An iron hand had been attached to his arm, and with it he wielded his sword as lethally as before. Refusing to acknowledge any overlord but the emperor, he became one of those robber barons who, in the name of freedom, claimed full authority on their lands, even to pillaging wayfarers and waging private war. In 1495, Emperor Maximilian I had issued an edict against private wars, under the double penalty of ban by the empire and excommunication by the church. Goethe of the Iron Hand rejected the ban as contravening traditional rights, and the play turned at first on the struggle between the rebel knight and the Prince-Bishop of Bamberg. Goethe, loving women much more than war, let the center of interest pass to Adelaide von Walldorf, whose beauty and wealth fired a dozen men with reckless passion. For her, Adalbert von Weislingen, another free knight, broke his alliance with Goethe and his troth with Goethe's sister Maria, and went over to the bishop. Perhaps in Weislingen's vacillating love, Goethe remembered his own unfaithfulness. He sent a copy of the play to Friederike by a friend, saying, "Poor Friederike will feel somewhat consoled when she sees that the faithless lover is poisoned." The author colored history to suit his drama. Gottfried von Berlichingen was not so noble and magnanimous as Goethe's Goethe, but such emendations are poetic licenses, like tortured rhymes. Forgivable, too, is the rough, wild speech which Goethe ascribed to his hero as echoing virility. When the play was produced in Berlin in 1774, Frederick the Great condemned it as a detestable imitation of the barbarism that he, like Voltaire, saw in Shakespeare, and he called upon German dramatists to seek their models in France. Herder at first agreed with Frederick, and told Goethe, "Shakespeare has ruined you." But he sent the published version to his friends with high praise. "You have hours of enchantment before you. There is an uncommon degree of authentic German power, depth, and sincerity in the piece, though now and then it is merely an intellectual exercise." The younger generation hailed Goethe as the supreme expression of Sturm und Drang. German readers were glad to hear of medieval knights, symbols of the mighty German character. Protestants relished the echoes of Luther in Brother Martin, who complains that his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience are unnatural, who describes woman as the glory and crown of creation, welcomes wine as rejoicing the heart of man, and overturns an old adage by saying that joyousness is the mother of every virtue. Even Goethe's father, who had to help him with his law and regarded him as a deterioration of the paternal stock, admitted that perhaps there was something in the lad after all. In May 1772, the young advocate had to go on legal business to Wetzlar, seat of the imperial appellate court. Not at all absorbed in law, he wandered through fields, woods, and boudoirs, drawing, writing, absorbing. In Wetzlar he met Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem, poet and mystic, and Georg Christian Kästner, a notary whom Goethe described as distinguished by a calm and equable demeanor, clearness of view, serene and tireless activity, and so confident of advancement that he was already engaged to marry. Kästner described Goethe magnanimously. 23 years old, the only son of a very wealthy father. According to his father's intention, he was to practice law at the court here. According to his own, he was to study Homer and Pindar, and whatever else his genius, his taste, and his heart should inspire. Indeed, he has true genius, and is a man of character. He possesses an imagination of extraordinary vividness, and expresses himself in images and similes. His feelings are violent, but he is usually master of them. His convictions are noble. He is quite free from prejudice, and acts as he likes without caring whether it pleases others, or is the fashion, or is permissible. All compulsion is hateful to him. He loves children and can play with them for hours. He is a quite remarkable man. On June 9, 1772, at a country dance, Goethe met Kästner's betrothed, Charlotte Buff. The next day he visited her and found a new charm in womanhood. Lotte, then 20, was the eldest sister in a family of 11. The mother was dead, the father was busy earning a living. Lotte served as mother to the brood. She not only had the bright gaiety of a healthy girl, she also had the attractiveness of a young woman who, simply but neatly dressed, performed the duties of her place with competence, affection, and good cheer. Goethe soon fell in love with her, for he could not remain long without some feminine image warming his imagination. Kästner saw the situation, but, sure of his possession, showed an amiable tolerance. Goethe allowed himself almost the privileges of a rival wooer, but Lotte always checked him and reminded him that she was engaged. Finally, he asked her to choose between them. She did, and Goethe, his pride only momentarily shaken, left Wetzlar the next day, September 11th. Kästner remained his loyal friend till death. Before returning to Frankfurt, Goethe stopped at Ehrenbreitstein on the Rhine, the home of Georg and Sophia von der Roche. Sophia had 2 daughters, of whom the eldest, Maximiliana, soon particularly attracted me. It is a very pleasant sensation when a new passion begins to stir in us before the old one is quite extinct. Thus, when the sun is setting, one likes to see the moon rise on the opposite side. Maximiliana, however, married Peter Brentano and bore a lively daughter, Bettina, who fell in love with Goethe 35 years later. Goethe resigned himself to Frankfurt and law. Not quite, for at times he thought of suicide. Among a considerable collection of weapons, I possessed a handsome, well-polished dagger. This I laid every night by my bed, and before extinguishing the candle I tried whether I could succeed in plunging the sharp point a couple of inches deep into my heart. Since I could never succeed in this, I at last laughed myself out of the notion, threw off all hypochondriacal fancies, and resolved to live. To be able to do this with cheerfulness, I was obliged to solve a literary problem, by which all that I had felt should be reduced to words. For this purpose I collected the elements which had been at work in me for a few years. I rendered present to my mind the cases which had most affected and tormented me, but nothing would come to a definite form. I lacked an event, a fable in which they could be seen as a whole. A fellow advocate at Wetzlar provided the amalgamating event. On October 30th, 1772, Wilhelm Jerusalem, having borrowed a pistol from Kästner, killed himself in despair over his love for the wife of a friend. All at once, when I heard the news of Jerusalem's death, Goethe recalled, the plan of Werther was formed, and the whole ran together from all sides. Perhaps so, but it was not until 15 months later that he began to write the book. Meanwhile, he carried on with Maximiliana Brentano, who had moved with her husband to Frankfurt, a flirtation so persistent that the husband protested and Goethe withdrew. A variety of abortive literary projects distracted him. He dallied with the idea of retelling the story of the Wandering Jew. He planned to have him visit Spinoza, and to show that Satan, to all appearances, was triumphing over Christ in Christendom. But he wrote only 10 pages of Der ewige Jude. He composed some satires on Jacobi, Wieland, Herder, Lenz, and Lavater, but managed to win their friendship nevertheless. He contributed to Lavater's Physiognomische Fragmente, and allowed him to physiognomize his head, with flattering results. Intelligence is here, with sensibility to kindle it, judged the Swiss. Observe the energetic brow, the eye so swiftly penetrating, searching, enamored, and the nose in itself enough to proclaim the poet. With the virile chin, the well-opened, vigorous ear, who could question the genius in this head? And who could live up to such a cephalogram? Jacobi thought it could be done, for after visiting Goethe in July 1773, he described him in a letter to Wieland as, from head to toe, all genius, a man possessed who is destined to act according to the dictates of the individual spirit. At last, in February 1774, Goethe wrote the book that gave him a European renown, Die Leiden des jungen Werthers. He had thought of it so long, had so long rehearsed it in brooding and fancy, that now he dashed it off, he tells us, in 4 weeks. I isolated myself completely. I forbade the visits of my friends. 50 years later, he said to Eckermann, that was a creation which I, like the pelican, fed with the blood of my own heart. He killed Werther to give himself peace. He was inspired in making the book brief. He used the letter form, partly in imitation of Richardson's Clarissa and Rousseau's Julie, partly because it lent itself to the expression and analysis of emotion, and perhaps because in that form he could use some of the letters he had written from Wetzlar to his sister Cornelia or to his friend Merck. He shocked Charlotte and Kestner by giving her actual name, Lotte, to the object of a love obviously describing Goethe's passion for Kestner's bride. Kestner became Albert, and was favorably portrayed. Even the meeting at the dance and the morrow's visit were in the story as they had been in fact. Since that day sun, moon, and stars can go calmly about their business, but I am conscious neither of day nor of night, and the whole world around me is fading away. I have no more prayers to say except to her. Werther is not quite Goethe. He is more sentimental, more given to tears and gushing words and self-commiseration. In order to lead the narrative to its tragic denouement, Werther had to be changed from Goethe to Wilhelm Jerusalem. The final touches echo history. Werther, like Jerusalem, borrows Albert's pistol for his suicide, and Lessing's Emilia Galati lies on his desk as he dies. No clergyman escorted him to his grave. The Sorrows of the Young Werther was an event in the history of literature and of Germany. It expressed and promoted the romantic element in Sturm und Drang, as Goetz von Berlichingen had expressed the heroic. Rebellious youth acclaimed it with praise and imitation. Some dressed in blue coat and buff vest like Werther, some wept like Werther, some committed suicide as the only fashionable thing to do. Kestner protested at the invasion of his privacy, but was soon appeased, and we are not told that Charlotte complained when Goethe told her, "Your name is uttered in reverence by thousands of adoring lips." The German clergy did not join in the applause. A Hamburg preacher denounced Werther as an apology for suicide. Pastor Goetze, Lessing's enemy, blasted the book, and Lessing condemned it for its sentimentality and lack of classic restraint. At a public dinner, the Reverend J.C. Hasenkampf censured Goethe to his face for that wicked piece of writing, and added, "May God improve your perverse heart." Goethe deflated him with a soft answer, "Remember me in your prayers." Meanwhile, the little book swept through Europe in a dozen translations, 3 in France in 3 years. Now, for the first time, France admitted that Germany had a literature. 3. The Young Atheist. The clergy had some excuse for worrying about Goethe, for he was in this stage openly hostile to the Christian Church. He reveres the Christian religion, Kestner wrote in 1772, but not in the form our theologians give it. He does not go to church, nor to communion, and he rarely prays. Goethe was especially averse to the Christian emphasis on sin and contrition. He preferred to sin without remorse. He wrote to Herder, about 1774, "If only the whole teaching of Christ were not such bilge that I, as a human being, a poor limited creature of desires and needs, am infuriated by it." He planned a drama on Prometheus as a symbol of man defying the gods. He wrote little more than a prologue, which shocked Jacobi and pleased Lessing. What remains of it is the most radical of Goethe's anti-religious outbursts. Prometheus speaks. "Cover thy heaven, Zeus, with cloudy mist, and disport yourself, like a child who cuts off thistle-heads, on oaks and mountain peaks. My earth you must still let stand, and my cottage, which you did not build, and my hearth, whose glow you envy me. I know nothing poorer under the sun than you, O gods. You nourish your majesty with difficulty from sacrifices and votive prayers, and it would starve were not children and beggars such hopeful fools. When I was but a child and knew not what to think, my erring eyes turned to the sun, as if there might be an ear to hear my plaint, a heart like mine to pity a troubled soul. Who helped me against the Titan's insolence? Who rescued me from death, from slavery? Has not my own holy, glowing heart accomplished all this by itself, but young and good and deceived gives thanks to that sleeping one up there? Honor thee? Why? Have you ever lightened the sorrows of the heavy laden? Have you ever dried the tears of the anguish-stricken? Have I not been molded into a man by almighty time and everlasting fate, my masters and yours? Here sit I, forming men after my image, a race that may be like me, to grieve and weep, to enjoy and be glad, and to disdain you as I do." From this nadir of proud atheism, Goethe moved slowly to the gentler pantheism of Spinoza. Lavater reported that Goethe told us many things about Spinoza and his writings. He had been an extremely just, upright, poor man. All modern deists had drawn primarily from him. His correspondence, Goethe added, was the most interesting in the whole world as concerned uprightness and love of humanity. 42 years later, Goethe told Karl Zelter that the writers who had most influenced him were Shakespeare, Spinoza, and Linnaeus. On June 9, 1785, he acknowledged the receipt of Jacobi's book on the teachings of Spinoza. His discussion of Jacobi's interpretation reveals considerable study of the Jewish philosopher-saint. Spinoza, he wrote, does not demonstrate the existence of God. He demonstrates that existence, the matter-mind reality, is God. Let others call him an atheist on this account. I am inclined to call him and praise him as most godly, even most Christian. I receive from him the most wholesome influences upon my thinking and acting. In his autobiography, Goethe remarked on his reply to Jacobi, "Happily I had already prepared myself, having in some degree appropriated the thoughts and mind of an extraordinary man. This mind, which had worked upon me so decisively, and was destined to affect so deeply my whole mode of thought, was Spinoza. After looking through the world in vain to find a means of development for my strange nature, I at last fell upon the ethics of this philosopher. I found in it a sedative for my passions, and a free, wide view over the sensible and moral world seemed to open before me. I was never so presumptuous as to think that I understood perfectly a man who raised himself through mathematical and rabbinical studies to the highest reach of thought, and whose name, even at this day, seems to mark the limit of all speculative efforts." He gave added warmth to his Spinozistic pantheism by the intensity with which he loved nature. It was not merely that he found delight in bright fields or mystic woods, or plants and flowers multiplying with such exuberant diversity. He also loved nature's sterner moods, and liked to fight his way through wind or rain or snow, and up to perilous mountain tops. He spoke of nature as a mother from whose breast he sucked the sap and zest of life. In a prose poem rhapsody, De Nature, from 1780, he expressed with religious feeling his humble surrender to, his happy absorption in, the generative and destructive forces that envelop man. Nature. By her we are surrounded and encompassed, unable to step out of her and unable to enter deeper into her. She receives us, unsolicited and unwarned, into the circle of her dance, and hurries along with us till we are exhausted and drop out of her arms. She creates ever new forms. What now is was never before. What was comes not again. All is new, and yet always the old. She seems to have contrived everything for individuality, but cares nothing for individuals. She is ever building, ever destroying, and her workshop is inaccessible. She has thought, and is constantly meditating, not as a man, but as nature. She has an all-embracing mind of her own. No one can penetrate her. She lets every child tinker with her, every fool pass judgment on her. Thousands stumble over her and see nothing. She has her joy in all. She is kindly. I praise her with all her works. She is wise and quiet. One can tear no explanation from her, extort from her no gift which she gives not of her own free will. She has placed me here, she will lead me away. I trust myself to her. She may do as she likes with me. She will not hate her work. In December 1774, Duke Karl August stopped at Frankfurt en route to seek a bride at Karlsruhe. He had read and admired Goethe von Berlichingen. He invited the author to meet him. Goethe came and made a favorable impression. The Duke wondered, might not this handsome and mannerly genius be an ornament of the Weimar court? He had to hurry on, but asked Goethe to meet him again on his return from Karlsruhe. Goethe spoke often of destiny, too little of chance. He might have answered that it was destiny, not chance, that brought him to the Duke, and that it turned him from the loveliness of Lili Schönemann to Weimar's unknown perils and opportunities. Lili was the only daughter of a rich merchant in Frankfurt. Goethe, now a social lion, was invited to a reception in her home. She performed brilliantly at the piano. Goethe leaned over a corner of it and drank in her 16-year-old charms as she played. I was sensible of feeling an attractive power of the gentlest kind. We grew into the habit of seeing each other. We were now necessary to each other. An irresistible longing dominated me. So rapidly can that famous fever rise, blown up by a poet's sensitivity. Before he quite realized what it meant, he was officially engaged in April 1775. Then Lili, thinking him securely captured, coquetted with others. Goethe saw and fumed. Just at this time, two friends, Counts Christian and Friedrich zu Stolberg, came to Frankfurt on their way to Switzerland. They suggested that Goethe join them. His father urged him to go, and to continue on into Italy. With some intimation, but without leave-taking, I separated myself from Lili. He started out in May 1775. At Karlsruhe he met the Duke again, and was definitely invited to Weimar. He went on to Zurich, where he met Lavater and Bodmer. He climbed St. Gothard, and looked longingly at Italy. Then the image of Lili regained ascendancy. He left his companions, turned homeward, and in September had Lili in his arms. But, back in his room, he felt again his old dread of marriage as imprisonment and stagnation. Lili resented his vacillation. They agreed to break off their betrothal. In 1776 she married Bernhard von Turckheim. The Duke, briefly at Frankfurt on his way back from Karlsruhe, offered to send a coach to take Goethe to Weimar. Goethe consented, made his arrangements, and waited for the appointed day. The coach did not come. Had he been played with and deceived? After some days of fretful delay, he started out for Italy. But at Heidelberg the promised coach caught up with him. The Duke's emissary made explanations and apologies. Goethe accepted them. On November 7th, 1775, he reached Weimar, aged 26, torn as always between Eros and destiny, longing for woman, but resolved to be great. Goethe, Counselor, 1775 to 1786. Goethe was welcomed to Weimar by all but the politicians. "I must tell you," wrote Wieland to Lavater, November 13, 1775, "that Goethe has been with us since Tuesday last, and that within 3 days I have conceived so deep an affection for this magnificent person, I so thoroughly see into him, feel and understand him, as you can far better imagine than I can describe." In that same month a member of the court wrote to Goethe's parents, "Conceive of your son as the most intimate friend of our dear Duke, loved to adoration, too, by all the good ladies hereabout." But there were clouds. The Duke relished wild hunts and drinking. Goethe at first accompanied him in both. Klopstock publicly charged the poet with corrupting a virtuous prince. Louisa feared that Goethe would alienate her husband from her. Actually, he used his influence to bring the Duke back to the Duchess, despite the fact that the marriage had not been one of love. Some officials distrusted Goethe as a Sturm und Drang radical with pagan beliefs and romantic dreams. Several gladiators of that movement, Lenz, Klinger, and more, rushed to Weimar, introduced themselves as Goethe's friends, and clamored for plums. When Goethe took a fancy to a garden house, outside the city gate but near the ducal castle, Karl August lost Goethe some public goodwill by evicting the tenants so that Goethe might move in, on April 21, 1776. There the poet found relief from court etiquette, and learned to grow vegetables and flowers. For 3 years he lived there all the year round, then only in the summer till 1782, when he moved to a spacious mansion in the town to attend to his mounting duties as a member of the government. The Duke had thought of him as a poet, and had invited him to Weimar as a literary ornament to his court. But he perceived that the 26-year-old author of a rebel play and a tearful romance was becoming a man of practical judgment. He appointed Goethe to a bureau of works, and asked him to look into the condition and operation of the mines at Ilmenau. Goethe did this with such assiduity and intelligence that Karl August determined to add him to the Privy Council that administered the duchy. A senior member protested against this sudden infusion of poetry and threatened to resign. The Duke and the Dowager appeased him, and on June 11, 1776, Goethe became Geheimer Legationsrat, Privy Councillor of Legation, at an annual salary of $1,200. He reduced his attentions to the ladies. For long now, Wieland informed Merck on June 24th, from the moment that he decided to devote himself to the Duke and the Duke's affairs, he has behaved with faultless wisdom and with worldly circumspection. In 1778 Goethe was advanced to the then peaceful post of Minister of War, and in 1799 to full membership in the Privy Council. He attempted some reforms, but found himself thwarted by vested interests at the top and public apathy below. Soon he himself was a complete conservative. In 1781 he was made president of the ducal chamber. In 1782 he was given by Joseph II a patent of nobility, and became von Goethe. In those days, he told Eckermann 45 years later, I felt so satisfied with myself that if I had been made a prince I should not have thought the change so very remarkable. Interwoven with his political career was the most lasting, intense, and poignant love affair in his life. Hear Dr. Johann Zimmermann's quite unmedical description of one of his patients in November 1775. The Baroness von Stein, wife of the chamberlain and master of the horse, has extraordinarily large black eyes of the highest beauty. Her voice is gentle and repressed. No one can fail to mark on her face seriousness, gentleness, kindliness, virtue, and profound sensibility. The manners of the court, which she possesses to perfection, have been transformed in her case into rare and high simplicity. She is very pious, with a touching and almost ecstatic elevation of soul. From her exquisite carriage and her almost professional skill in dancing, one would hardly infer the tranquil moonlight which fills her heart with peace. She is 33 years old. She has several children and weak nerves. Her cheeks are red, her hair quite black, her complexion of an Italian hue. Born in 1742, Charlotte von Schardt had married Baron Josias Gottlob von Stein in 1764. By 1772 she had borne 7 children, of whom 4 were now dead. When Goethe met her, she was still ailing from repeated pregnancies, and her sense of frailty entered into the modesty and diffidence of her character. Goethe idealized her, for he had the blood of a youth and the imagination of a poet, accustomed and commissioned to embellish reality. Yet he did not exceed her position in glorifying her. She was something new in his rosary of women. She was an aristocrat in whom fine manners seemed inborn, and Goethe saw her as enshrined in nobility. It was one result of their relationship that she transmitted to him the manners of her class, and schooled him in self-possession, ease, moderation, and courtesy. She was grateful for his love as restoring her interest in life, but she accepted it as a woman of breeding receives the adoration of a youth 7 years younger than herself, as the growth pains of an eager spirit seeking experience and fulfillment. It was not love at first sight. 6 weeks after joining the Weimar Circle, he was still writing verses about lovely Lily Schönemann. But on December 29, 1775, Dr. Zimmermann remarked Goethe's awakening to new virtues and beauties in Charlotte. By January 15th, he was trying to resist the incipient enthrallment. "I am glad to get away and wean myself from you," he told her. By January 28th, he had quite surrendered. "Dear angel," he wrote to her, "I'm not coming to the court. I feel too happy to stand the crowd. Suffer me to love you as I do." And on February 23rd, "I must tell you, O you chosen among women, that you have placed a love in my heart which makes me joyful." She wrote many letters in return, but from this first period only one survives. "I had so detached myself from the world, but now it grows dear to me again, dear through you. My heart reproaches me. I feel that I torment both myself and you. 6 months ago I was so ready to die, and I am ready no longer." He was in ecstasy. "There is no explanation for what this woman does to me," he told Wieland, "unless you accept the theory of transmigration. Oh, yes, once we were man and wife." He took the matrimonial privilege of quarreling and making up. Charlotte to Zimmermann, May 1776. "He stormed away from me a week ago, and then returned with overflowing love. What will he end by making of me?" Apparently she insisted upon their love remaining platonic, and he was too passionate to leave it so. "If I am not to live with you," he told her, "your love avails me no more than that of others who are absent." But on the next day, "Forgive me for making you suffer. I'll try hereafter to bear it alone." He was desolate when she went to far north Piedmont for a cure, but when she returned she visited him at Ilmenau from August 5th to 6th, 1776. On August 8th he wrote, "Your presence has had a wondrous effect upon me. When I think that you were here in my cave with me, and that I held your hand while you leaned over me, your relationship to me is both sacred and strange. There are no words for it, and the eyes of men cannot perceive it." Almost 5 years after their first meeting he was still warm. So, on September 12th, 1780, lonely in Zilbach, "Whenever I awake from my dreams, I find that I still love you and long for you. Tonight, as we were riding along and saw the lit windows of a house ahead, I thought, if only she were there to be our hostess. This is a rotten hole, and yet if I could live quietly here all winter long with you, I'd like it very well." And on March 12th, 1781, "My soul has so grown into yours that, as you know, I am inseparably tied to you, and neither height nor depth can part us. I wish there were some vow or sacrament which would bind me to you visibly and according to some law. How precious that would be! And surely my novitiate was long enough for me to take all due thought. The Jews have cords which they bind about their arms in the act of prayer. Thus I bind about my arm your dear cord when I address my prayer to you, and desire you to impart to me your goodness, wisdom, moderation, and patience. Some have interpreted the expired novitiate or period of probation as indicating Charlotta's physical surrender. And yet he wrote to her 6 years later, "Dear Lotta, you do not know what violence I have done to myself and still do, and how the thought that I do not possess you exhausts and consumes me." If consummation came, the secret was well kept. Baron von Stein, who did not die till 1793, bore with the liaison with the courtesy of an 18th-century gentleman. Occasionally Goethe ended his letters with regards to Stein. He had learned to love her children, too, feeling more and more keenly the lack of his own. In the spring of 1783, he persuaded her to allow her 10-year-old boy, Fritz, to stay with him for extended visits, even to accompany him on long trips. One of her letters to Fritz in September 1783 shows her maternal side and the human hearts behind the dehumanized facade of history. "I am so glad that you don't forget me out in the beautiful world, and that you write me intolerably, though not very well-formed, letters. Since you're staying much longer than I expected, I'm afraid that your clothes won't be looking very well. If they get soiled, and you too, tell Privy Councillor Goethe just to throw my dear little Fritz into the water. Try to appreciate your good luck, and to do your best to please the Councillor by your behavior. Your father wishes to be remembered to you." By 1785, Goethe's passion had subsided into long silences. In May 1786, Charlotte complained that Goethe thinks a great deal and says nothing. She was now 44, he was 37, and was retiring into himself. Often he went to Jena to get away from the Weimar court and seek rejuvenation among students. He had always refreshed himself with nature, climbing the Brocken, a 3,747-foot peak in the Harz Mountains, long associated with the Faust legend, and traveling with the Duke in Switzerland, from September 1779 to January 1780. Sometimes, in retrospect, he felt that during the first 10 years of my official and court life at Weimar I scarcely accomplished anything in the way of literature or science. But it was good that the poet had been crossed with the administrator, and that the half-spoiled youth and faithless lover had been disciplined by the responsibilities of office and the deferment of amorous victory. He made use of every experience and grew with every defeat. "The best thing about me is that deep inner stillness in which I live and grow, despite the world, and through which I gain what the world can never take from me." Nothing was lost on him. Everything found expression somewhere in his works. Finally, he was all the best of intellectual Germany fused into an integrated whole. Two of his greatest poems belong to this period: The Marriage of Philosophy and Religion, Poetry and Prose in Die Natur, and the most perfect of his lyrics, the second of those called Wanderer's Nachtlied, which he carved on the walls of a hunting lodge on September 7, 1780, perhaps in a mood of restless longing. "O'er all the hilltops is quiet now. In all the tree-tops hearest thou hardly a breath. The birds are asleep in the trees. Wait, soon, like these, thou too shalt rest." Another of Goethe's famous lyrics belongs to this stage of his development, the somber Erlkönig, which Schubert put to music. When has the child sense of mystic beings pervading nature been more vividly expressed than in this swift fantasy of the dying child who sees the king of the elves coming to snatch it from the arms of its father? Now, too, Goethe wrote in prose 3 dramas: Egmont in 1775, Iphigenia auf Tauris in 1779, and Torquato Tasso in 1780. Fruit enough for 5 political years. Egmont was not produced till 1788. Iphigenia was presented at the Weimar Theatre on April 6, 1779, 6 weeks before the premiere of Gluck's opera of the same name. But it was so transformed, as well as versified, during Goethe's stay in Rome that it will be better viewed as a product of Goethe's classic phase. Tasso also was remodeled and versified in Italy, but it belongs here as part of Goethe's enchantment with Charlotte von Stein. On April 19, 1781, he wrote to her, "All that Tasso says is addressed to you." Taking him at his word, she identified herself with Leonora, Goethe with Tasso, and Karl August with the Duke of Ferrara. Goethe readily accepted the legend that Tasso's mental breakdown at the Ferrara court was intensified, if not brought on, by an unhappy love affair with a sister of Alfonso II, who reigned from 1559 to 1597. He doubtless had himself in mind when he described the working of Tasso's poetic mind. His eye scarce lingers on this earthly scene, to nature's harmony his ear is tuned. What history offers, and what life presents, his bosom promptly and with joy receives. The widely scattered is by him combined, and his quick feeling animates the dead. Thus, moving in his own enchanted sphere, the wondrous man doth still allure us on to wander with him and partake his joy. Though seeming to approach us, he remains remote as ever, and perchance, his eye resting on us, sees spirits in our place. And Leonora, the stately princess who accepts the poet's love but bids him restrain his ardor within protocol, may well be Charlotte von Stein holding Goethe's passion this side of adultery. Tasso proclaims, and here both poets speak, "Whatever in my song doth reach the heart and find an echo there, I owe to one and one alone. No image undefined hovered before my soul, approaching now in radiant glory to retire again. I have myself with mine own eyes beheld the type of every virtue, every grace." Duke Alfonso resembles Karl August in patience with the poet's tantrums, amours, and reveries, and like him mourns the poet's delay in finishing a promised masterpiece. After each slow advance he leaves his task. He ever changeth and can ne'er conclude. Which well describes Goethe's piecemeal composition, and his procrastination with Wilhelm Meister and Faust. Another princess praises Alfonso, Karl August, for giving Tasso Goethe a chance to mature by contact with affairs. And here rise famous lines. Talent forms itself in quiet. Character takes form in the stream of the world. But the correlation between the two poets fades at the end. Tasso shows none of Goethe's capacity for swimming in the worldly stream. He sinks into his realm of dreams, throws caution and proportion to the winds, clasps the startled princess in his arms, and goes insane when she removes herself from his embrace and his life. Perhaps Goethe felt that he had skirted that precipice. He often thought of Italy as an escape from a situation that threatened his mind. About this time, in the first form of Wilhelm Meister, he composed for Mignon a song of longing that fitted his own hopes rather than Mignon's. Know you the land where the lemon trees bloom, where the golden oranges glow in the dark foliage, where a soft wind blows from the blue sky, and the quiet myrtle and the lofty bay tree stand? Do you know it well? There would I go with you, O my beloved. Weimar was beautiful, but it was not warm, and the cares of office rasped the poet's soul. 'Tis a bitter way of earning one's bread to have to try to establish harmony among the discords of the world. Court life wearied him. I have nothing in common with these people, nor they with me. He had been partly estranged from the Duke, unable to keep the ducal pace of hunting and wenching. His one great love had been worn thin by time and quarrels. He felt that he had to break away from these many bonds, to seek a new orientation and perspective. He asked the Duke for a leave of absence. The Duke consented and agreed to continue Goethe's salary. To raise additional funds, Goethe sold to Gershon of Leipzig the right to publish an edition of his collected works. Only 602 sets were bought. Gershon lost $1,720 in the enterprise. On September 1st, 1786, Goethe wrote to Charlotte from Carlsbad, "Now a final farewell. I want to repeat to you that I love you dearly, and that your assurance that you are again taking pleasure in my love renews the joy of my life. I have borne much in silence hitherto, but I have desired nothing more intensely than that our relationship might take a form over which no circumstance could have power. If that cannot be, I would not dwell where you are, but rather be alone in that world into which I now go forth. 4. Goethe in Italy, 1786–88. He travelled under a pseudonym, Monsieur Jean-Philippe Müller, for he wished to be freed from the inconveniences of fame. He was 37 years old, but he came with even more than the bright expectancy of youth, and much better prepared, knowing something of Italy's history and art. On September 18th he wrote to Herder, "I hope to return a new-born person," and to Karl August, "I hope to bring back a thoroughly cleansed and far better equipped human being." To these and other friends he sent letters from Italy that still have in them the allegrezza of Italian life. He prefaced them with the old motto, "Auch in Arkadien." He, too, was now in Arcady. We have seen elsewhere how grateful he was for the sunshine. "I believe in God again," he cried out as he entered Italy. But he loved the Italian people, too, their open faces and hearts, the naturalness of their lives, the passion and jollity of their speech. Being a scientist as well as a poet, he made note of meteorological peculiarities, geological formations, mineral specimens, varieties of animals and plants. He liked even the lizards that darted over the rocks. He was so eager to reach Rome that he passed hurriedly through Venetia, Lombardy, and Tuscany, but he stopped long enough in Vicenza to feel the classic simplicity and power of Palladio's architecture. He strongly reaffirmed his antipathy to Gothic. "From all taste for those tobacco-pipe shafts, our little steeple-crowned towers and foliated terminals, I am now, thank God, set free forever. Palladio has opened the road for me to every art." Through that road he went back to Vitruvius, whom he studied in an edition by Galliani, our witty friend from Naples and Paris. The classical style now became a passion with him, coloring his works and thought, reforming some past productions like Iphigenia and Tasso into classic mold and line. In Venice the Baroque palaces seemed immodestly garish, too femininely elegant, and even from the Renaissance facades he turned to the relics of classic architecture and statuary in the museums. But his warm blood responded to the color and pride of Veronese and Titian. In Ferrara he sought in vain the palace where Tasso had been confined. After 3 days in Bologna and only 3 hours in Florence, he rushed on through Perugia and Terni and Città di Castello, and on October 29, 1786, he rode through the Porta del Popolo into Rome. Now he felt a passing moment of modesty. "All roads are open to me because I walk in a spirit of humility." Not yet master of spoken Italian, he sought out the German colony, and especially the artists, for he aspired to learn at least the elements of drawing, painting, and sculpture. Angelica Kauffmann admired his enthusiasm and good looks. She painted a portrait of him, stressing his black hair, lofty forehead, and clear eyes. He formed an intimate friendship with Johann Heinrich Wilhelm Tischbein, who handed him down to us in the famous Goethe in der Campagna, reclining at ease as if he had conquered Arcady. Long before coming to Italy, Goethe had corresponded with this painter. They met for the first time on November 3rd, when they converged in the Piazza San Pietro. The poet recognized the artist and introduced himself simply. "I am Goethe." Tischbein described him in a letter to Lavater. "I found him to be quite what I had expected. The only thing that surprised me was the gravity and tranquillity of one of such vivid sensibility, and also that he is able to be at ease and at home in all circumstances. What pleases me still more is the simplicity of his life. All he asked me to provide for him was a little room where he could sleep and work without interruption, and the very simplest fare. Now he sits in that little room and works at his Iphigenia from early in the morning till 9 o'clock. Then he goes out to study the great works of art." Tischbein often guided him in these explorations, made drawings for him, and secured for him copies of the more famous paintings. Goethe himself made sketches of what he especially wished to recall. He tried his hand at sculpture and modeled a head of Hercules. He admitted that he had no talent for the plastic arts, but he felt that these experiments gave him a better sense of form and helped him to visualize what he wished to describe. He pored over Winckelmann's History of Ancient Art. Here on the spot I find it highly valuable. Now at last my mind can rise to the greatest and purest creations of art with calm consideration. The history of the whole world attaches itself to this spot, and I reckon a true new birth since the day I entered Rome. I think I am changed to the very marrow. Meanwhile, he seems to have enjoyed the living art provided by the dainty models who posed in the studios. His stay in Rome completed that de-romantification which had begun with the responsibilities of office. Now the lawlessness of Goethe and the tears of Werther seemed to the maturing Goethe signs of an unbalanced mind. Romanticism is a disease, he said. Classicism is health. There was something romantic in his new enthusiasm for classic marbles, columns, capitals, and pediments, and the pure lines of Greek statuary. If we really want a pattern, we must always return to the ancient Greeks, in whose works the beauty of mankind is constantly represented. Like Winckelmann, Goethe saw only the Apollonian side of Greek civilization and art, the exaltation of form and restraint. He now almost ignored that Dionysian ecstasy which so warmly colored Greek character, religion, and life, and which in Goethe himself had spoken through his daimon and his loves. It was in this classic rapture that he rewrote Iphigenia auf Tauris in verse in 1787, resolved to rival Racine, even Euripides himself. Still cherishing the embers of the fire that Charlotte von Stein had ignited in him, he poured into the speeches of the Greek princess something of the tenderness and self-control of the German baroness. He told the old story well, with all its complications of mythology and genealogy. He intensified the drama by portraying the Scythian king favorably, and he dared to change the ending to accord with the idea, rare among the Greeks, that one has moral obligations even to barbarians. Only those who can read German fluently can appreciate Goethe's performance. Yet Hippolyte Taine, a Frenchman, a supreme critic and presumably familiar with Racine's dramas, said, "I place no modern work above Goethe's Iphigenia auf Tauris." The memories of Charlotta in this play, and still more in Torquato Tasso, which he rewrote in Rome, revived his feeling for her. She had been deeply wounded by his sudden flight to Italy, and by his leaving her boy in charge of a servant. She at once took Fritz back and demanded the return of all the letters she had written to Goethe. He wrote apologetically from Rome on December 8th, 13th, and 20th, 1786. She sent him on December 18th a note of bittersweet reproof. He answered on December 23rd, "I cannot express to you how it pierces my heart that you are ill, and ill through my fault. Forgive me. I myself fought with death and life, and no tongue can speak the things that went on within me." Finally, she relented. Now, he wrote on February 1st, 1787, "I can go to work in a happier mood, since I have a letter from you in which you say that you love and take delight in my letters." In that month he and Tischbein went to Naples. He ascended Vesuvius twice. On his second attempt a minor eruption covered his head and shoulders with ashes. He reveled in the classic ruins at Pompeii, and marveled at the simple majesty of the Greek temples at Paestum. Returning to Rome, he took ship to Palermo, went on to study the classic temples at Segeste and Girgenti, Agrigento, stood in the Greek theatre at Taormina, and was back in Rome in June. More and more in love with the most remarkable city in the whole world, he persuaded Duke Karl August to continue his salary to the end of 1787. When that extension expired, he slowly reconciled himself to the north. He left Rome on April 25th, 1788, traveled leisurely through Florence, Milan, and Como, and reached Weimar on June 18th. Every day he wondered how the Duke, the court, and Charlotta would receive a Goethe who felt himself transformed. 5. Goethe Waiting, 1788 to 1794. With the absent poet's consent, the Duke had appointed a new president of the council. Now, at his own request, Goethe was relieved of all official duties except as Minister of Education, and henceforth he served the council only in an advisory capacity. The Duke was kind, but he had taken other intimates, and he did not like the semi-republican sentiments of the rewritten Egmont. The reading public had almost forgotten Goethe. It had taken up a new poet called Schiller, and had enthusiastically applauded a play, The Robbers, full of that Sturm und Drang rebelliousness and violence, which now seemed absurd and immature to a poet ready to preach classic order and restraint. Charlotte von Stein received him coldly. She resented his long absence, his leisurely return, his persistent rapture with Italy, and perhaps she had heard of those models in Rome. Their first meeting after his arrival was utterly false in tone, she wrote, and nothing but boredom was exchanged between us. She left for a stay in Kochberg, and Goethe was free to think of Christiane Vulpius. She came into his life on July 12, 1788, bearing a message from her brother. She was 23 years old and worked in a factory making artificial flowers. Goethe was struck with her fresh spirit, her simple mind, her budding womanhood. He invited her to his garden house as his housekeeper, and soon made her his mistress. She had no education, and cannot understand poetry at all, said Goethe, but she yielded herself trustfully and gave him the physical fulfillment that Charlotte had apparently refused. In November 1789, when she was nearing motherhood, he took her into his Weimar home and openly made her his wife in all but name. Charlotte and the court were shocked at his crossing class lines and his failure to veil the illicit relation. This reaction caused him and Christiane much grief, but the Duke, an old hand with mistresses, served as godfather to the child that was born on Christmas Day, 1789, and Herder, stern but forgiving, christened it August. Goethe, so often a lover but only now a father, found much happiness in The Little Man and Das kleine Weib, the little woman. She kept house for him, she listened to him lovingly even when she did not understand him, and she gave him health. "Since she first crossed this threshold," he told a friend, "I have had nothing but joy of her." Her only fault in his eyes was that she loved wine even more than he did, and that it sometimes led her to almost uncontrolled merriment. She frequented the theatre and went to many dances, while Goethe stayed home and celebrated her in his Römische Elegien, 1789 to 1790, written in the manner of Propertius and with the morals of Catullus. There is nothing mournful about these Roman elegies. They get their names from their elegiac meter of alternating hexameters and pentameters. And they concern not Rome, but a merry widow, through whose disguise we see Christiane herself. "All that thy sacred walls, eternal Rome, hold within them, teemeth with life, but to me all is still silent and dead. O, who will whisper unto me? When shall I see at the casement that one beauteous form, which, while it scorcheth, revives? Do not repent, mine own love, that thou so soon didst surrender. Trust me, I deem thee not bold. Reverence only I feel. Alexander and Caesar and Henry and Frederick the mighty on me would gladly bestow half of the glory they earned, could I but grant unto them one night on the couch where I'm lying. But they by Orcus's night sternly, alas, are held down. Therefore rejoice, O thou living one, blessed in thy love-lighted homestead, ere the dark Lethe's sad wave wetteth thy fugitive foot." That pretty widow may have been a Roman memory, but the warmth of these lines came from Christiane. After all, was he not studying art? "Yet it is studious, too, with sensitive hand, to mark her bosom's lovely curves, and let wise fingers glide down the smooth thigh, for thus I master the antique sculptor's craft, reflect, compare, and apprehend, to come and see with feeling eye, and feel with seeing hand." The Weimar ladies were not pleased by this cheapening exposure of their charms, and the stately Charlotte mourned the degeneration of her Galahad. Even Karl August was a bit disturbed, but was soon appeased. When the Dowager Duchess was returning from Italy, he sent Goethe to Venice to escort her home. His stay there, from March to June 1790, was protracted uncomfortably. He longed for Christiane, and vented his irritation with Italian shopkeepers and hygiene in Venezianische Epigramme, the least attractive of his works. On his return from Venice, he found that the French Revolution was arousing the youth of Germany to ecstasy and the rulers to fear. Many of his friends, including Wieland and Herder, were applauding the overthrow of monarchical absolutism in France. Goethe, perceiving that all thrones were threatened, took his stand beside the Duke and counseled caution. So many people, he said, were running about with bellows in their hands, when it seems to me they had better be looking for cold water jugs to control the fire. He obeyed the order of Karl August to accompany him in the campaign of the first coalition against France. He was present at the Battle of Valmy on September 20th, 1792, stood calmly under fire, and shared in the defeat. A German officer recorded in his diary that when the poet-councillor was asked to comment on the event, he answered, "From today and from this place begins a new epoch in the history of the world." We have no confirmation of this story. In any case, back in Weimar, Goethe wrote vigorously against the revolution, which was entering the period, 1792–94, of its excesses and savagery. These developments confirmed in Goethe the natural turn of the maturing mind from a zest for liberty to a love of order. As any fool can be original, so Goethe felt that any fool can live arbitrarily, safely violating customs or laws because others observe them. He had no enthusiasm for democracy. If ever such a system should actually be practiced, it would be the sovereignty of simplicity, ignorance, superstition, and barbarity. He was kindly and generous within his sphere, and spent part of his income in secret charities, but he shrank from the crowd. In the presence of multitudes or strangers, he withdrew proudly and timidly within himself, and found his only happiness in his home. In these unsettling years, from 1790 to 94, he fell into a sombre torpor from which he was aroused by the touch of Schiller's ardent youth and the competition of his pen. 6. Schiller Waiting, 1787 to 1794. When Schiller reached Weimar, Goethe was in Italy. The almost penniless poet admitted jealousy of the absent counsellor. While he is painting in Italy, the Toms, Dicks, and Harrys are sweating for him like beasts of burden. He is squandering a salary of 1,800 thalers there, and here they have to work double tides for half the money. On August 12, 1787, he wrote more favorably, "Goethe is spoken of here by many with a sort of devotion, and is even more loved and admired as a man than as an author. Herder says he has a most clear judgment, great depth of feeling, and the purest sentiments. According to Herder, Goethe is free from all spirit of intrigue. He has never done harm to anyone. In his political transactions he acts more openly and boldly. Herder says that as a man of affairs Goethe is more deserving of admiration than as a poet, that he has a mind large enough for anything." The Duke was away when Schiller came, but Anna Amalia and Charlotte von Stein received him cordially. Wieland told him that he was wanting in polish, clearness, and taste, and offered to polish him. Soon the eager poet was contributing to Wieland's Deutsche Merkur. He found more intimate entertainment with Charlotte von Kalb, who, like the other Charlotte, had a broad-minded husband. "People begin to whisper pretty loudly here about my connection with Charlotte. Herr von Kalb has written to me. He comes here at the end of September, and his arrival will greatly influence my arrangements. His friendship for me remains unchanged, which is astonishing, for he loves his wife, and is aware of my intimacy with her. But he can never for one moment doubt her fidelity. He still remains the honest, good-hearted fellow he always was." On August 27, 1787, Don Carlos had its premiere in Hamburg. Schiller was too fond of Weimar to attend. This, his first play in verse, was both praised and condemned as a surrender to the style of French tragedy, but it lacked the dramatic unity required by Aristotelian rules. It began with the conflict between Philip II and his son for the love of Elizabeth of Valois. Then, mid-play, the center of interest shifted to the struggle of the Netherlands to free themselves from Spanish suzerainty and Alva's cruelty. Schiller tried to give an impartial portrait of Philip, and Protestant readers applauded the appeal of Marquis Posa to the king. "Your Majesty, I lately passed through Flanders and Brabant, so many rich and blooming provinces, filled with a valiant, great, and honest people. To be the father of a race like this, I thought must be divine indeed. and then I stumbled upon a heap of burned men's bones. Restore us all you have deprived us of, and generous and strong, let happiness flow from your horn of plenty. Let man's mind ripen in your vast empire, and become amidst 1,000 kings a king indeed. Let every subject be what once he was, the end and object of the monarch's care, bound by no duty save a brother's love. Despite the success of Don Carlos, Schiller for a long time abandoned drama. In 1786 he had written to Körner, "History has with each successive day new attractions for me. I wish I had studied nothing else for 10 years altogether. I think I should have been another sort of being. Do you think there is yet time to make up for what I have lost?" He could not support himself, much less a family, on the proceeds of occasional plays that even after an applauded premiere might wither to an early death. Perhaps some successful work of history would give him sufficient reputation as a scholar to win a professorship at the University of Jena. There he would be only 14 miles from Weimar, and still within the jurisdiction and bounty of the Duke. So, after finishing Don Carlos, he gave his pen to A History of the Fall of the United Netherlands. As Schiller could not read Dutch, he relied on secondary authorities, from whose narratives he put together a compilation of no lasting worth. Körner criticized Volume 1 in 1788 with his usual honesty. "The present work, with all its talent, does not bear the stamp of that genius of which you are capable." Schiller abandoned the Netherlands. No second volume came. On July 18, 1788, Goethe returned from Italy, and in September met Schiller in suburban Rudolstadt. Schiller reported to Körner, "The high idea I had conceived of him is not lessened in the slightest degree, but I doubt if we shall ever draw very close to each other. He is so far ahead of me that we cannot meet on the road. His whole life from the very beginning has run in a direction contrary to mine. His world is not my world. On some points our notions are diametrically opposed." And indeed the two poets seemed providentially designed to dislike each other. Goethe, 39, had arrived and matured. Schiller, 29, was climbing and experimenting. Only in proud egotism did they agree. The younger man was of the people, poor, writing semi-revolutionary lines. The other was rich, a man of rank and state, a privy councillor, deprecating revolution. Schiller was just emerging from Sturm und Drang. He was the voice of feeling, sentiment, freedom, romance. Goethe, wooing Greece, was all for reason, restraint, order, and the classic style. In any case, it is not natural for authors to like one another. They are reaching for the same prize. When they returned to Weimar, Goethe and Schiller lived only a short walk from each other, but they did not communicate. Matters were worsened by the appearance of Schiller's hostile review of Goethe's Egmont. Goethe decided that Little Athens was not large enough to contain both of them. In December 1788 he recommended Schiller for a chair in history at Jena. Schiller gladly accepted and called on Goethe to thank him, but in February 1789 he wrote to Körner, "It would make me unhappy to be a great deal in Goethe's society. He never warms even toward his best friends. Nothing attaches him. I verily believe he is an egotist of the first water. He possesses the talent of putting men under an obligation to him by small as well as great acts of courtesy, but he always manages to remain free himself. I look upon him as the personification of a well-calculated system of unbounded selfishness. Men should not tolerate such a being near them. He is hateful to me for this reason, though I cannot do otherwise than admire his mind and think nobly of him. He has aroused in me a curious mixture of hatred and love." On May 11, 1789, Schiller took up his duties at Jena, and on May 26th he delivered his inaugural address on What is, and to what end does one study, universal history? Admission being free, the audience proved far too large for the room assigned, and the professor moved with his auditors in a gay stampede to a hall at the other end of town. This lecture was highly praised. The students gave me a serenade that night and 3 rounds of cheers. But enrollment for the course for which admission was charged was small, and Schiller's scholastic income was meager. He added to it by writing. In 1789-91 he brought out, in 3 installments, History of the 30 Years' War. Here he was at home, at least with the language, though again he was too harassed to go to the primary sources, and his predilection for judging and philosophizing colored and halted the tale. Nevertheless, Wieland hailed the work as indicating Schiller's capacity for rising to a level with Hume, Robertson, and Gibbon. 7,000 copies of Volume 1 were sold in its first year. Schiller now felt that he could indulge his longing for a home and for a woman to give him love and care. He had had a brief glimpse of Charlotte and Carolina von Lengefeld at Mannheim in 1784. He saw them again at Rudolstadt in 1787. Lotte was living there with her mother, and Carolina, unhappily married, was living next door. Both, without being pretty, Schiller wrote to Kerner, are interesting and please me exceedingly. They are well read in the literature of the day, and give proofs of a highly finished education. They are good performers on the piano. Frau von Lengefeld frowned upon the idea of her daughter marrying an impecunious poet, but Karl August gave him a small pension of 200 thalers, and the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen secured him a patent of nobility. He warned Lotte that he had many faults. She told him she had noticed them, but added, "Love is loving people as we find them, and if they have weaknesses, accepting them with a loving heart." They were married on February 22nd, 1790, and took a modest home in Jena. Lotte brought her own income of 200 thalers a year, gave him 4 children, and proved through all his tribulations a patient and tender wife. "My heart swims in happiness," he wrote, "and my mind draws fresh strength and vigor." He worked hard, preparing 2 lectures a week, writing articles, poems, and history. For months he labored 14 hours a day. In January 1791 he suffered 2 spells of catarrhal fever, involving gastric pains and expectoration of blood. For 8 days he lay in bed, his stomach rejecting all food. Students helped Lotte to care for him, and vied with one another as to who should sit up with me at night. The Duke sent me 6 of old Madeira, which, with some Hungarian wine, has done me good service. In May he was attacked by a fearful spasm, with symptoms of suffocation, so that I could not but think that my last moment had come. I took farewell of my loved ones, and thought to pass away any minute. Strong doses of opium, camphor, and musk, and the application of blisters relieved me most. A false report of his death alarmed his friends, and reached even to Copenhagen. There, on suggestions from Karl Reinhold and Jens Baggesen, 2 Danish noblemen, Duke Friedrich Christian of Holstein-Augustenburg and Count Ernst von Schimmelmann, offered Schiller an annual gift of 1,000 thalers for 3 years. He received it gratefully. The university excused him from teaching, but he lectured to a small private circle. Part of his new leisure he gave, at Reinhold's urging, to the study of Kant's philosophy, which he accepted almost completely, to Goethe's amusement and Herder's disgust, and perhaps with some detriment to Schiller's poetry. Now, in 1793, he sent forth his long essay on Grace and Dignity, which began the romantic cultivation of Die schöne Seele. A beautiful soul he defined as one in which reason and the senses, duty and inclination, are in harmony and are outwardly expressed in grace. The Copenhagen donors must have been alarmed to receive, as some return for their gift, a little volume entitled Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Mankind, 1793–94. Starting with Kant's conception of the sense of beauty as a disinterested contemplation of harmonious forms, Schiller argued, with Shaftesbury, that the feeling developed by the beautiful refines manners, and the aesthetic sense becomes one with morality. It is a consolation to read, in this pronouncement from Weimar's halcyon days, that Schiller, like Goethe, thought his generation decadent, sunk in profound moral degradation. When he turned back from philosophy to poetry, he found it difficult to recapture that boldness and living fire I formerly possessed. Critical discussion has spoiled me. But he insisted that the poet is the only authentic human being. The best philosopher is a mere caricature compared with him. And he exalted to the plane of celestial inspiration the function of the poet to teach and raise mankind. In a long ode, Die Künstler, the artists, from 1789, he described poets and artists as guiding mankind to the union of beauty with morality and truth. In another poem, Die Goethe Griechenlands, The Gods of Greece, 1788, he lauded the Greeks for their aesthetic sensibility and artistic creations, and argued with cautious obscurity that the world had become gloomy and ugly since the replacement of Hellenism by Christianity. He was already falling under Goethe's spell, as Goethe had fallen under Winckelmann's. Probably in both Schiller and Goethe the romantification of Hellas was an escape from Christianity. Despite some pious passages, Schiller, as well as Goethe, belonged to the Aufklärung. He accepted the 18th century faith in salvation by human reason rather than by divine grace. He retained a deistic belief in God, personal only in poetry, and a misty immortality. He rejected all churches, Protestant as well as Catholic. He could not bear sermons, even Herder's. In an epigram entitled Mein Glaube, My Faith, he wrote two famous lines. Which religion do I acknowledge? None of all those that you name to me. And why none? Because of religion. He wrote to Goethe on July 9, 1796, A healthy and beautiful nature, as you yourself say, requires no moral code, no law for its nature, no political metaphysics. You might as well have added that it requires no Godhead, no idea of immortality wherewith to support and maintain itself. Nevertheless, there were factors of imagination and tenderness in him that drew him back toward Christianity. I find that Christianity virtually contains the first elements of what is highest and noblest, and its various outward forms seem distasteful and repulsive to us only because they are misrepresentations of the highest. No sufficient emphasis has been placed upon what this religion can be to a beautiful mind, or rather what a beautiful mind can make of it. This explains why this religion is so successful with feminine natures, and why it is that only in women is it at all supportable. Schiller was not, like Goethe, physically built for thorough paganism. His face was handsome but pale, his frame tall but thin and frail. He distrusted the diurnal vacillations of the weather and preferred to sit in his room smoking and taking snuff. He contrasted himself with Goethe as idea versus nature, imagination versus intellect, sentiment versus objective thought. He was at once timid and proud, shrinking from hostility but always fighting back, occasionally irritable and impatient, perhaps because aware that his time was running out, often critical of others, sometimes envious. He had a tendency to moralize about everything and to take a high idealistic tone. It is a relief to find him enjoying the eroticism of Diderot's Les Bijoux Indiscrets. He analyzed his own talent well in an early letter to Goethe. The poetic mind generally got the better of me when I ought to have philosophized, and my philosophical mind when I wished to poeticize. Even now it often happens that imagination intrudes upon my abstractions, and cold reason upon my poetical productions. If I could obtain such mastery over these two powers as to assign to each its limits, as Goethe did, I might yet look forward to a happy fate. But alas, just when I have begun to know and to use my moral energies rightly, illness seizes me and threatens to undermine my physical powers. His ailment returned with fury in December 1793. He recovered, but the sense that he could not be cured and must expect recurrent seizures darkened his mood. On December 10th he wrote to Körner, I struggle against this with all the force of my mind, but I am always driven back. The uncertainty of my prospects, doubts of my own genius, which is not sustained and encouraged by contact with others, the total absence of that intellectual conversation which has become a necessity to me. These were the mental accompaniments of his physical trials. He looked with longing from Jena to Weimar to the enviably healthy Goethe, that mens sana in corpore sano. There, Schiller felt, was the man who could give him stimulus and support. If only the ice between them would melt, if only that 14-mile barrier would fall away. 7. Schiller and Goethe, 1794 to 1805. It fell for a moment when, in June 1794, both men attended in Jena a session of the Society for Natural History. Encountering Goethe as they left the hall, Schiller remarked that the biological specimens exhibited at the conference lacked life, and could offer no real help to understanding nature. Goethe emphatically agreed, and the conversation kept them together till they reached Schiller's home. The talk induced me to go in with him, Goethe later recalled. I expounded to him the Metamorphosis of Plants, a treatise in which Goethe had argued that all plants were variations of one primitive type, the Erbpflanze, and that nearly all parts of a plant were variations or developments of the leaf. He heard all this with much interest and distinct apprehension, but when I had done he shook his head and said, "This is not experiment, it is an idea." That is, it was a theory not yet verified by observation or test. The comment nettled Goethe, but he saw that Schiller had a mind of his own, and his respect for him grew. Schiller's wife, whom I had loved and valued since her childhood, did her best to strengthen our reciprocal understanding. In May of 1794, Schiller had signed a contract to edit a literary monthly to be called Die Horen. The Horae in Greek mythology were the goddesses of the seasons. He hoped to enlist as contributors Kant, Fichte, Klopstock, Herder, Jacobi, Baggesen, Körner, Reinhold, Wilhelm von Humboldt, August Wilhelm von Schlegel, and, best catch of all, Goethe. On June 3rd he sent to Weimar a letter addressed to Hochwohlgeborener Herr, Hochsouveränender Herr Geheimer Rat, High and well-born Sir, highly honored Sir Privy Councillor, a prospectus of the proposed magazine, and added, "The enclosed paper expresses the wish of a number of men whose esteem for you is unbounded, that you would honor the periodical with contributions from your pen, in regard to the value of which there can be but one voice among us. We feel, Your Excellency, that your consent to support this undertaking will be a guarantee of its success." Goethe replied that he would gladly contribute, and was certain that a closer connection with the sterling men who form your committee will arouse to new life much that is now stagnant within me. So began a correspondence that is among the treasures of literary history, and a friendship whose exchange of respect and aid, lasting for 11 years, till Schiller's death, should enter into our estimate of mankind. Perhaps the most revealing of the 999 extant letters is the fourth, of August 23, 1794, in which Schiller, after several meetings with Goethe, analyzed with both courtesy and candor, both modesty and pride, the differences between their minds. My recent conversations with you have put the whole store of my ideas in motion. Many things about which I could not come to a right understanding with myself have received new and unexpected light from the contemplation I have had of your mind, for so I call the general impression of your ideas upon me. I needed the object, the body, to several of my speculative ideas, and you have put me on the track for finding it. Your calm and clear way of looking at things keeps you from getting lost in the side roads into which speculation, as well as arbitrary imagination, are so apt to lead me astray. Your correct intuition grasps all things, and that far more perfectly than what is laboriously sought for by analysis. Minds like yours seldom know how far they have penetrated, and how little cause they have to borrow from philosophy, which in fact can only learn from them. Although I have done so at a distance, I have long watched the course which your mind has pursued. You seek for the necessary in nature, but you look at nature as a whole when seeking to get light thrown on her individual parts. You look for the explanation of the individual in the totality of all her various manifestations. Goethe's answer, on August 27th, cleverly avoided an analysis of Schiller's mind. For my birthday, which occurred this week, I could have received no more agreeable gift than your letter, in which, with a friendly hand, you sum up my existence, and in which, by your sympathy, you encourage me to a more assiduous and active use of my powers. It will be a pleasure to unfold to you at leisure what your conversation has been to me, how I too regard those days as an epoch in my life, for it seems to me that after so unexpected a meeting we cannot but wander on in life together. Goethe followed this up on September 4th with an invitation to Schiller to come and spend some days with him in Weimar. You could take up any kind of work you like without being disturbed. We would converse together at convenient hours, and I think we would not part without some profit. You should live exactly as you like and as much as possible as if you were in your own home. Schiller readily accepted, but warned Goethe that the asthmatic spasms from which I suffer oblige me to stay in bed all morning, since they leave me no peace at night. So from September 14th to 28th, Schiller was Goethe's guest, almost his patient. The older man took tender care of the ailing poet, guarded him against annoyance, gave him dietetic counsel, taught him to love fresh air. Back in Jena, Schiller wrote on September 29th, "I find myself at home again, but my thoughts are still in Weimar. It will take me a long time to unravel all the ideas which you have awakened in me." Then, on October 8th, with characteristic eagerness, he urged, "It seems to me necessary that we should come at once to some clear understanding about our ideas of the beautiful." There followed 3 months of preparation for the first number of Die Horen. This appeared on January 24th, 1795, the second on March 1st, the rest monthly for 3 years. Goethe reported from Weimar on March 18th, "People are running after it, snatching the numbers from one another's hands. We could not want more for a beginning." On April 10th, Schiller informed Goethe, "Kant has written me a very friendly letter, but begs for a delay in sending his contributions. I am glad we have induced the old bird to join us." Goethe asked that his own pieces be unsigned, for they included several of his Roman elegies, and he knew that their lusty sensuality would seem unbecoming in a privy councillor. In the rash enthusiasm of success, Schiller persuaded Goethe to join him in another periodical, Der Musenalmanach, which appeared yearly from 1796 to 1800. The liveliest pieces in this were the Xenian, that the two poets wrote on the model of Martial's Xenia. Epigrams written as gifts to guests. Schiller described the project to Körner. "The whole affair consists in a conglomeration of epigrams, of which each is a single couplet. They are chiefly wild and impish satires, especially against authors and their works, interspersed here and there by sudden flashes of poetical or philosophical ideas. There will be no less than 600 of such monadistics." Goethe had suggested this plan as a way to strike back at their critics, to make fun of pompous authors and bourgeois tastes, and to stir the German reading public to a keener interest in literature. They would send these gifts into the camp of the Philistines like foxes with burning tails. The epigrams were unsigned, and some of them were the joint product of the two conspirators. Since many of these burning tales were directed at authors or controversies now forgotten, time has extinguished their fire, but one of them, by Goethe, especially merits remembrance. "Always strive for the whole, and if you yourself cannot become a whole, tie yourself to some whole as a serving part." Another distich, usually credited to Schiller, extends the thought. "You are frightened by death? You wish to live undying? Live in the whole. When you are long gone hence, it will remain." The satirical part of the Xenian brought counterattacks which made Schiller suffer and Goethe laugh. Goethe advised Schiller to let his work be his sole reply. "After our mad venture with the Xenian, we must take pains to work only on great and dignified works of art, and shame all our adversaries by transforming our protean natures into noble forms." It was done. In these years of their developing friendship, Goethe and Schiller wrote some of their finest poems. Goethe, The Bride of Corinth, and The God and the Bayadeer. Schiller, The Walk, in 1795, The Cranes of Ibycus, in 1797, and The Song of the Bell in 1800. Schiller added a major essay, Über naive und sentimentalische Dichtung, in 1795, and Goethe sent forth Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre in 1796. By naive and sentimental poetry, Schiller meant poetry born of objective perception versus poetry developed by reflective feeling. Secretly, he was comparing Goethe and Schiller. The naive poet is not simple or superficial or deluded. He is one who is so readily adjusted to the external world that he feels no opposition between himself and nature, but approaches reality through direct and unhesitating intuition. Schiller cites Homer and Shakespeare as examples. As civilization becomes more complex and artificial, poetry loses this objective immediacy and subjective harmony. Conflict enters the soul, and the poet has to recapture through imagination and feeling, as an ideal remembered or hoped for, this concord and union of the self with the world. Poetry becomes reflective, clouded with thought. Schiller believed that most Greek poetry was of the naive or direct sort, and most modern poetry the result of discord, disunity, and doubt. The ideal poet is he who will fuse both the simple and the reflective approaches in one vision and poetic form. Goethe later pointed out that this essay became a fountainhead of the debate between classical and romantic literature and art. The embryology of Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre illustrates Goethe's method of creation. He conceived the story in 1777, completed Book 1 in 1778, put it aside, and did not finish Book 2 until July 1782. He worked on Book 3 until November of that year, and on Book 4 till November 1783. Books 5 and 6 dragged along for 3 years more. He called these 6 books Wilhelm Meister's Theatralische Sendung, and read parts of them to friends. Then he laid them aside. He took up the tale again in 1791 on the urging of Herder and Anna Amalia, added 2 books by June 1794, submitted the growing manuscript to Schiller, who sent back criticisms, suggestions, and encouragement as the pages came. It was almost a picture of a midwife assisting at a long-overdue birth. At last, in 1796, the whole was delivered to the press. No wonder the final product was slightly deformed, weak in structure, adipose and confused, excellent only in parts and in its mirroring of Goethe's uncertain wandering amid conflicting interests and vague ideals. That decisiveness and self-confidence which Schiller ascribed to him were the proud concealment of internal vacillation and strife. Lehrjahre, learning years, expressed the period of apprenticeship in the German guilds. Through that time of tutelage, Wilhelm became Meister, master. So the meandering theme of the novel is Wilhelm's slow and painful apprenticeship in the guild of life. Because of the puppet shows Goethe had loved as a child, and his continuing interest in the theatre, he tied the tale to a troupe of actors passing through a dozen towns and 100 vicissitudes as lessons in living and pictures of German ways. Faithful to his own unfaithfulness, he made his hero enter upon the scene by deserting his mistress Mariana. Wilhelm is not an alluring character. He lets himself be carried from one situation or idea to another by the whim of circumstance or the power of personality. It is the woman who takes the initiative in his love affairs. Born a bourgeois, he flounders in admiration for men of noble birth, and humbly hopes that these will someday recognize the aristocracy of the mind. Philina is more attractive, a pretty actress who waltzes lightly from love to love, but graces her erotic tourism with a contagious gaiety and an absolving unconsciousness of sin. Unique is little Mignon, who follows her old father dutifully as he strums his harp in penny-gathering peregrinations. Goethe describes her as speaking very broken German, but puts into her mouth that perfect song, Kennst du das Land? She falls in adolescent love with Wilhelm, who loves her as a child, and she dies in grief when she sees him in Therese's arms. Ambroise Thomas plucked her out of these 800 pages to make of her a sad and delightful opera in 1866. Schiller praised the calm serenity of the style in Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, and the truth to life in the description of a wandering troupe, but he pointed out contradictions in chronology, psychological improbabilities, offenses against taste, and faults in characterization and design. He proposed changes in the plot and gave his ideas as to how the story should end. Goethe assured him, "I shall certainly comply with your just wishes as far as I possibly can." But he confessed to Eckermann 33 years later that it was all he could do to protect his novel from Schiller's influence. Other critics were less friendly. One described the book as a brothel on tour, and Charlotte von Stein complained that when Goethe deals with lofty emotions, he always flings some dirt at them, as if to deprive human nature of any pretensions to the divine. The novel did not deserve these indiscriminate censures. It has many pleasant pages and can still carry the interest of readers freed from the tumult of the world. On March 23, 1796, Schiller went again to Weimar as Goethe's guest. There they worked together for the theatre. Goethe was a strict manager, chose the plays to be presented, and trained the actors. All that was morbid, weak, lachrymose, or sentimental, as well as all that was frightful, horrible, or offensive to decorum, was utterly excluded. The audience was usually confined to the court, except when some students were invited from Jena. August von Schlegel remarked acidly, "Germany has two national theaters, Vienna with a public of 50,000 and Weimar with a public of 50. Schiller returned to Jena April 12th, stimulated by his renewed contact with the stage to revert from history, philosophy, and incidental poetry to the drama. He had long thought of writing a play on Wallenstein. Goethe urged him to proceed with it. In November, Goethe went to Jena and lived for some time in daily communication with Schiller. Back in Weimar, Goethe wrote, "Do not fail to make use of your best hours, so as to get on with your tragedy, that we may begin to discuss it." While Schiller worked on Wallenstein, Goethe, stirred to rivalry by the success of Johann Heinrich Vosse's verse idol of German life and sentiment, Louisa, of 1795, tried his hand at this favorite genre, and published in 1798 Hermann und Dorothea. Hermann is the strong and healthy, shy and quiet son of a bilious father and tender mother, who keep the Golden Inn and an extensive farm in a village near the Rhine. They learn that hundreds of refugees are approaching from a frontier town captured by the French. The family make up parcels of clothing and food, which Hermann conveys to the refugees. He finds among them a lass with swelling bosom and neatly shaped ankles, who is serving them with aid and comfort. He falls in love with her, and after due tribulations brings her home to his parents as his bride. The story is told in fluent hexameters. Vignettes of rural life give color to the tale. Calls for the expulsion of the French invaders pleased patriotic Germans who had found Iphigenia auf Taurus and Torquato Tasso foreign and recondite, and the little epic gave new popularity to an author who, since Werther, had had few readers outside the Saxe-Weimar Duchy. Schiller's star was in the ascendant from 1798 to 1800. On November 28, 1796, he wrote to Körner, "I am still brooding seriously over Wallenstein, but the unfortunate work is still before me, shapeless and endless." He began it in prose, put it aside, then started it again in verse. The material was partly familiar to him from his studies for his History of the 30 Years' War, but it was so abundant, so complex in characters and events, that he abandoned the attempt to compress it into 5 acts. He decided to preface the drama with a 1-act prologue called Wallenstein's Lager, Wallenstein's Camp, and to divide the remainder into 2 plays. Di Piccolomini expounded the plot to depose the rebellious general, and set it off with a fiery love affair between Wallenstein's daughter and the son of a leader in the plot. The final and essential drama would be Wallenstein's Tod. When Goethe read the prologue, he was so struck by the realistic portrayal of an army camp and the clever preparation for later developments that he insisted on staging Wallenstein's Lager in the Weimar Theatre on October 12, 1798, before Di Piccolomini was complete. Perhaps it was a subtle way of keeping the poet to his task. Early in 1799, Schiller went to Weimar to stage Di Piccolomini. It had its premiere on January 30th and was well received. He returned to Jena and worked feverishly on The Death of Wallenstein. A letter of March 19, 1799, reveals the mood of a writer emerging from the ardor of creation. "I have long dreaded the moment when I should be rid of my work, much as I wished that moment would come, and in fact I feel my present freedom to be worse than the state of bondage that I have been in heretofore. The mass which has hitherto drawn and held me to it has now gone, and I feel as if I were hanging indefinitely in empty space." Excitement enough came with the rehearsals and premiere, on April 20th, 1799, of Wallenstein's Tod. Its success was complete. Even the highly critical Weimar audience felt that it had witnessed a masterpiece of dramatic presentation. Schiller had now reached the peak of his development. He had shortened the speeches and intensified the action. He had drawn all the leading characters with vitality and power. He had brought all the threads of the plot together in the tragic denouement, the ignominious death of a great man ruined by limitless ambition and pride. Schiller felt that he could now stand on an equality with Goethe, and in the field of drama he was justified. Probably at Goethe's suggestion, the Duke added 200 thalers to Schiller's pension and invited him to reside in Weimar. On December 3, 1799, the family moved to a house so close to Goethe's that for a time the 2 poets saw each other every day. Meanwhile, carried onward by his triumph, Schiller had flung himself into another play. "Thank God," he wrote to Kerner on May 8, 1799, "I have already hit upon a new subject for a tragedy." For his Maria Stuart, he studied the historical background, but he laid no claim to writing history. He proposed to write a play using history as material and background. He rearranged events and chronology for dramatic consistency and effect. He stressed the unpleasant elements in Elizabeth's character, and made Mary an almost immaculate heroine, and he brought the two queens face to face in a dramatic confrontation. History knows of no such meeting, but the scene is one of the most powerful in the literature of the stage. When it was presented at Weimar, June 14, 1800, Schiller was again exalted with success. By July he was at work on Die Jungfrau von Orleans. Here, too, he revised history to his purpose. In place of burning the Maid, he pictured Joan as escaping from her English captors, rushing into battle to rescue her king, and dying in victory on the field. The premiere at Leipzig on September 18, 1801, was the greatest triumph that Schiller ever had. Was Goethe jealous of his friend's sudden rise to ascendancy on the German stage? He rejoiced over it, and 28 years later he still judged Wallenstein's Tod so great that there is nothing else like it of the kind. However, he did not rank his rival as high in poetry as in drama. He felt that Schiller had clouded his poetry with philosophy and had never quite mastered the music of verse. When some admirers of Schiller wished to stage a tribute to him in the Weimar theatre, Goethe forbade it as too ostentatious. In July 1800 he went to Jena, while Schiller remained in Weimar. But on November 23rd, Schiller still spoke in terms of friendship unimpaired. He ranked Goethe as the most gifted man since Shakespeare. In the 6 years of our intimacy, no slightest doubt of his integrity ever arose. He possessed the highest veracity and sense of honor, and the deepest earnestness in the pursuit of what is right and good. I wish, he added, that I could justify Goethe as warmly in respect of his domestic relations. Through false notions of what constitutes domestic happiness, and through an unhappy fear of marriage, he has slipped into an entanglement which oppresses him and makes him wretched in his very home, and which he is too weak and soft-hearted to shake off. This is his only vulnerable spot. Schiller's wife, like the other ladies of Weimar, would not receive Christiane in her home, and Schiller rarely mentioned Christiane in his extant communications with Goethe. Despite these flaws in the friendship of the Dioskuren, as they were sometimes called, it at least proved that a classic and a romantic genius might live in harmony. They sent messages to each other almost every day. They frequently had supper together. Goethe often put his carriage at Schiller's disposal. He sent to Schiller a portion of the order which my wine merchant has just delivered. "Let us have a walk together toward evening," Goethe wrote on April 20th, 1801. And on June 11th, "Farewell, give my kind greetings to your dear wife, and gladden me on my return from Göttingen by showing me some fruits of your industry." And on June 28th, 1802, "A key to my garden and garden-house will be given you. I want you to have as good a time there as possible." 22 years after Schiller's death, Goethe said to Eckermann, "It was fortunate for me that I found Schiller, for different as our natures were, our tendencies were still toward one point, which made our connection so intimate that one really could not live without the other." In the final years of their alliance, each was handicapped by disease. For the first 3 months of 1801, Goethe suffered from nervousness, sleeplessness, violent influenza, and abscesses that for a time closed his eyes. At one stage he was unconscious for so long that Weimar expected his death. On January 12th, Charlotte von Stein wrote to her son Fritz, "I did not know that my former friend Goethe was still so dear to me, and that a serious illness, which overcame him 9 days ago, would so shake me to the very core." She took Christiana's boy, August, into her home for a while to ease the burdens that Goethe's sickness had laid upon his mistress, who tended him tirelessly. His recovery was slow and painful. "It is hard," he wrote to Charlotte, "to find the way back." In 1802, Schiller, now prosperous from the rising proceeds of his acted and published plays, bought a home in Weimar for 7,200 gulden, and Goethe, then in Jena, helped him to sell the house he had lived in there. On March 17, 1803, Schiller produced Die Braut von Messina, a self-confessed attempt to rival Sophocles' Oedipus, by portraying, with a divided chorus, the strife of two brothers in love with a woman who turns out to be their sister. The play did not please. Goethe experienced a similar setback when, in 1803, he staged Die natürliche Tochter. Among the spectators at a performance of The Natural Daughter was a brilliant and volatile lady, Germaine Necker, Madame de Stael, who was gathering material for her book, De l'Allemagne. She saw Schiller for the first time in December 1803, in the salon of the Duke and Duchess of Weimar, in a society as enlightened as it is exalted. He read French very well, but he had never spoken it. I maintained with some warmth the superiority of our dramatic system over that of all others. He did not refuse to enter the lists with me without feeling any uneasiness from the difficulty and slowness with which he expressed himself in French. I soon discovered so many ideas through the impediment of his words. I was so struck with the simplicity of his character. I found him so modest, so animated, that I vowed him from that moment a friendship full of admiration. Schiller prepared Goethe for her. She represents the intellectual culture of France in its purity. The only trouble with her is her quite extraordinary volubility. One has to turn oneself into one concentrated organ of hearing in order to follow her. He brought her to Goethe on December 24th. Goethe reported, "A most interesting hour. I didn't get a chance to say a word. She speaks well, but far too much." Her own report was identical, except for a slight change. She said that Goethe had talked so much that she had not a chance to speak one syllable. Her book served as a revelation to France of Germany as the native land of thought. "It is impossible," she wrote, "that the German writers, the best informed and the most reflecting men in Europe, should not deserve a moment's attention to be bestowed upon their literature and their philosophy." Resolved to win back the audience that had rejected The Bride of Messina, Schiller, at Goethe's suggestion, chose for his next drama the popular story of William Tell. He was soon on fire with the theme. After he had gathered all necessary material, Goethe recalled in 1820, he sat down to work and did not get up from his chair until the play was finished. If weariness overcame him, he laid his head on his arm and slept a while. So soon as he awoke, he asked for strong black coffee to keep himself awake. So the play was written in 6 weeks. Schiller accepted as history the legend of a William Tell who had led the revolt of the Swiss against Austria in 1308. The revolt was real, so was Gessler, the hated Austrian bailiff. Gessler, in the legend, promised Tell full pardon if he proved his feigned prowess with bow and arrow by shooting an apple from his boy's head. Tell placed 2 arrows in his belt. With the first he shot the apple. Gessler asked for what he had intended the second. Tell answered, "For you, if the first should strike my son." The play was acclaimed at Weimar on March 17, 1804, and soon thereafter everywhere. Switzerland adopted it as part of its national lore. Published, the play sold 7,000 copies in a few weeks. Schiller was now more famous than Goethe. But he had less than a year of life left to him. In July 1804, he had so violent an attack of colic that his doctor feared for his death, and Schiller hoped for it. He recovered slowly and began another play, Demetrius, the false Dmitri of Russian history. On April 28, 1805, he saw Goethe for the last time. From that meeting, Goethe returned to his home and himself fell seriously ill with colic. On the 29th, Schiller's final sickness began. Heinrich Voss reported, "His eyes were sunk deep in his head, and every nerve twitched convulsively." The unhealthy tensions of literary effort, the inflammation of his bowels, and the decay of his lungs joined to destroy him. Schiller never drank much, said Goethe later. He was very temperate, but in such hours of bodily weakness he was obliged to stimulate his powers with spirituous liquors. On May 9th, Schiller met death with a strange calm. He bade farewell to his wife, his 4 children, and his friends. Then he fell asleep and did not wake again. An autopsy showed the left lung completely destroyed by tuberculosis, the heart degenerated, the liver, the kidney, and the intestines all diseased. The doctor told the Duke, "Under the circumstances we cannot help wondering how the poor man could have lived so long." Goethe was so ill at the time that no one dared tell him of Schiller's death. On May 10th, Christiana's sobbing revealed it to him. "I thought I was losing my own life," he wrote to Zelter, "and instead I lost a friend who was the very half of my existence." With what remained he came to his own fulfillment. Goethe Nestor, 1805 to 1832. 1. Goethe and Napoleon. Shall we, honoring our stated limits, leave Goethe suspended at this point, with Faust on his pen and wisdom in his age? Or shall we, burdening space and risking time, pursue this ever-evolving Olympian to his end? Die ewige Weisheit zieht uns hinan. Timeless wisdom draws us on. On October 14, 1806, Napoleon defeated the Prussians at Jena. Duke Karl August, allied with Prussia, had led his own little army against the French in that battle. The routed survivors, and then the hungry victors, entered Weimar, sacked the stores, and quartered themselves in private homes. 16 Alsatian troops took over Goethe's house. Christiana gave them food, drink, and beds. That night 2 other soldiers, intoxicated, forced their way in, and finding no more beds available on the lower floor, ran upstairs into Goethe's room, brandished their swords in his face, and demanded accommodations. Christiana placed herself between these soldiers and her mate, persuaded them to leave, and then bolted the door. On the 15th, Bonaparte reached Weimar and restored order. Instructions were issued that the distinguished scholar was not to be disturbed, and that all measures should be taken to protect the great Goethe and his home. Marshals Lannes, Ney, and Augereau stayed with him for a while, and then left with apologies and compliments. Goethe thanked Christiana for her bravery, and said to her, "God willing, we shall be man and wife." On October 19th they were married. His good mother, who had borne lovingly with all his faults and modestly with all his honors, sent them renewed blessings. She died on September 12, 1808, and Goethe inherited half of her estate. In October 1808, Napoleon presided over a meeting of 6 sovereigns and 43 princes at Erfurt, and remade the map of Germany. Duke Karl August attended, taking Goethe in his retinue. Bonaparte asked Goethe to visit him on October 2nd. The poet came and spent an hour with the conqueror Talleyrand, 2 generals, and Friedrich von Müller, a Weimar magistrate. Napoleon complimented him on his vigor. Goethe was then 59, inquired about his family, and launched into a spirited critique of Werther. He condemned current dramas that emphasized fate. "Why talk about fate? Politics are fate. Qu'en dit Monsieur Goethe? What does Monsieur Goethe say about it?" We do not know Goethe's reply, but Müller reported that as Goethe was leaving the room, Napoleon remarked to his generals, "Voilà un homme! Behold a man!" On October 6th, Napoleon returned to Weimar, taking with him a company of actors from Paris, the great Talma among them. They played, in Goethe's theatre, Voltaire's L'Amour de César. After the performance, the emperor took Goethe aside and discussed tragedy. "The serious drama," he said, "could very well be a school for princes as well as for the people, for in certain ways it is above history. You ought to portray the death of Caesar more magnificently than Voltaire has done, and show how happy Caesar, Napoleon, would have made the world if the people had only granted him time in which to carry out his lofty plans." And a little later, "You must come to Paris. I make this definite request of you. You will there obtain a larger view of the world, and you will find a wealth of themes for your poetry." When Napoleon passed through Weimar again, after his disastrous retreat from Moscow, he asked the French ambassador to convey his greetings to Goethe. The poet felt that in Bonaparte he had met, as he expressed it, the greatest mind the world has ever seen. He quite approved Napoleon's rule of Germany. After all, Goethe had written in 1807, there was no Germany, only a farrago of petty states, and the Holy Roman Empire had ceased to exist in 1806. It seemed good to Goethe that Europe should be united, especially under so brilliant a head as Bonaparte's. He did not rejoice over Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, though his duke again led the Weimar regiments against the French. His culture and concern were too universal to let him feel much patriotic glow, and he could not find it in him, though often asked to do so, to write songs of nationalistic fervor. In his 80th year he said to Eckermann, "How could I write songs of hatred when I felt no hate? And between ourselves, I never hated the French, although I thanked God when we were rid of them. How could I, to whom the only significant things are civilization and barbarism, hate a nation which is among the most cultivated in the world, and to which I owe a great part of my own culture? In any case, this business of hatred between nations is a curious thing. You will always find it most powerful and barbarous on the lowest levels of civilization. But there exists a level at which it wholly disappears, and where one stands, so to speak, above the nations, and feels the weal or woe of a neighboring people as though it were one's own. This level was appropriate to my nature. I had reached it long before my 60th year. Would that there had been in every major state 1,000,000 such good Europeans. 2. Faust, Part 1. Goethe did not accept Napoleon's invitation to move to Paris or to write about Caesar. He had long nurtured in his mind and his manuscripts a subject that moved him more deeply than even the most majestic political career: the struggle of the soul toward understanding and beauty, the defeat of the soul by the brevity of beauty and the elusiveness of truth, and the peace obtainable by the soul through narrowing the goal and broadening the self. But how to vision all this in a modern parable and dramatic form? For 58 years Goethe tried. He had learned the story of Faust in his childhood through chapbooks and puppet shows, and he had seen pictures of Faust and the devil on the walls of Auerbach's cellar in Leipzig. He himself in youth had meddled with magic and alchemy. His own restless search for understanding went into his conception of Faust. His reading of Voltaire and his contact with Herder's sarcasms went into Mephistopheles. The Gretchen whom he had loved in Frankfurt and the Friederike Brion whom he had deserted in Zensenheim gave name and form to Margaret. How deeply the story of Faust moved Goethe, how varied the forms it took in his thought, shows in the fact that he began to write the play in 1773 and did not finish it till 1831. Of his meeting with Herder in 1771 he wrote in his autobiography, "I most carefully concealed from him my interest in certain subjects which had rooted themselves in me and were little by little molding themselves into poetic form. These were Goetz von Berlichingen and Faust. The significant puppet show of the latter resounded and vibrated, many-toned, within me. I, too, had wandered about in all sorts of science, and had early enough been led to see its vanity. I had, moreover, tried all sorts of ways in real life, and had always returned unsatisfied and troubled. Now these things, as well as many others, I carried about with me, and delighted myself with them in solitary hours, but without writing anything down." On September 17, 1775, he told a correspondent, "I felt fresh this morning and wrote a scene of my Faust." Later in that month, Johann Zimmermann asked him how the play was progressing. He brought in a bag filled with 1,000 fragments of paper and threw it on the table. "There," he said, "is my Faust." When he went to Weimar in November 1775, the first form of the drama was complete. Dissatisfied with it, he put it aside. This Urfaust, or original Faust, never reached print till 1887, when a manuscript copy made by Fräulein von Goechhausen was found in Weimar. Through 15 more years he revised and expanded it. Finally he published it in 1790 as Faust, ein Fragment, which now runs to 63 pages. This was the first printed form of the most famous play since Hamlet. Still discontent with it, Goethe dropped the theme till 1797. On June 22nd he wrote to Schiller, "I have determined to take up my Faust again, breaking up what has been printed, arranging it in large masses, and further preparing the development. I only wish that you would be so good as to think the matter over in one of your sleepless nights, and tell me what you would demand of the whole, and to interpret my dreams to me like a true prophet." Schiller replied the next day, "The duality of human nature and the unsuccessful endeavor to unite in man the godlike and the physical is never lost sight of. The nature of the subject will force you to treat it philosophically, and the imagination will have to accommodate itself to serve a rational idea." Goethe's imagination was too rich, his vividly remembered experiences too many. He inserted many of them into the fragment, doubling its size, and in 1808 he gave the world what we now call Faust, Part 1. Before letting his puppet say a word, he prefixed to the drama a tender Zeugnung, dedication to his dead friends, and a droll prologue in the theatre between manager, playwright, and jester, and a prologue in heaven, wherein God bets Mephistopheles that Faust cannot be permanently won to sin. Then at last Faust speaks in simplest doggerel. "I have studied, alas, philosophy, jurisprudence, and medicine too, and saddest of all theology, with ardent labor through and through. And here I stick, as wise poor fool as when my steps first turned to school. Master they style me, nay, doctor forsooth, and nigh 10 years over rough and smooth, and up and down, and a crook and a cross, I led my pupils by the nose, and know that in truth we can know naught. This 4-foot meter, handed down from Hans Sachs's playlets, proved to be just the rippling rhythm for a drama that chastened philosophy with fun. Faust, of course, is Goethe, even to being a man of 60 years, and, like Goethe, he was still at 60 thrilled by feminine loveliness and grace. His double aspiration for wisdom and beauty was the soul of Goethe. It challenged the avenging gods by its presumption, but it was noble. Faust and Goethe said yea to life, spiritual and sensual, philosophical and gay. By contrast, Mephistopheles, who is not Satan, but only Satan's philosopher, is the devil of denial and doubt, to whom all aspiration is nonsense, all beauty a skeleton wearing skin. In many moments Goethe was this mocking spirit too, or he could not have given him such wit and life. At times Mephistopheles seems to be the voice of experience, of realism and reason, checking the romantic desires and illusions of Faust. Indeed, Goethe told Eckermann, the character of Mephistopheles is a living result of an extensive acquaintance with the world. Faust does not sell his soul unconditionally. He agrees to go to hell only if Mephistopheles shows him a pleasure so durably satisfying that he will be glad to stay with it forever. If ever on the bed of sloth I loll contented ever, then with that moment end my race. Should I to any moment say, tarry a while, you are so fair, then may you into fetters cast me, then will I gladly go down there. On this condition Faust signs the compact with his blood, and cries recklessly, our glowing passions in a sensual sea now will we quench. So Mephistopheles takes him to Margaret, Gretchen. Faust finds in her all the charm of that simplicity which departs with knowledge and returns with wisdom. He woos her with jewels and philosophy. Margaret. Tell me, how is't with thy religion, pray? Thou art a good and kindly man, and yet I think small heed thereto dost pay. Faust. Enough, dear child, I love thee, thou dost feel. For those I love my blood and life I'd spill, nor of his faith, his church, would any man bereave. Margaret. That is not right. We must believe. Dost thou believe in God? Faust. What man can say, my dearest, I believe in God? Margaret. Then thou believest not? Faust. Thou winsome angel face, mishear me not. Who can name him? Who thus proclaim him? I believe him? Who that has feeling, his bosom stealing, can say I believe him not? The all-embracing, the all-sustaining, clasps and sustains he not thee, me, himself? Springs not the vault of heaven above us? Leath not earth, firm stablished neath our feet? Great though it be, fill thou therefrom thine heart, and when in the feeling wholly blessed thou art, call it then what thou wilt. Call it bliss, heart, love, God. I have no name for it. Feeling is all, name is but sound and smoke clouding the glow of heaven. Margaret. It seemeth fair in these words of thine, but yet thou hast no Christianity. Faust. Dear child. She is moved not by his cloudy pantheism, but by the fine figure and raiment with which Mephistopheles' magic has endowed his restored youth. She sings at her spinning wheel a song of wistful longing. My peace is fled, my heart is sore, I shall find it never and nevermore. Him only I watch for, the window near, him only I look for, when forth I fare. His lofty gait, his lordly guise, the smile of his lips, the might of his eyes. My bosom yearns for him, for him. Ah, could I clasp him and cling to him and kiss him as fain I would, then I, faint with his kisses, should swoon and die. All the Western world knows the rest of the story, if only through Gounod. Margaret, in order to kiss and swoon unchaperoned, gives her mother a sleeping potion, from which the mother never wakes. Faust kills Margaret's brother, Valentine, in a duel, and then disappears. Margaret, in shame and grief, kills her fatherless child. She is arrested and condemned to death. Faust visits her in her dungeon and begs her to escape with him. She embraces him, but refuses to leave her cell. Mephistopheles draws Faust away, while a voice from heaven cries, "She is redeemed." Only slowly did the reading public realize that this Faust of 1808 was the finest drama and the finest poetry that Germany had yet produced. But some alert few recognized it at once as fit to stand among the peaks of the world's literature. Friedrich Schlegel compared Goethe with Dante. Jean-Paul Richter equaled him with Shakespeare. Wieland gave him in the realm of poetry the same sovereignty that Napoleon then held in government and war. 3. Nestor in Love. In the years 1818 to 1821, Goethe had 2 soul-stirring romances, not counting Bettina Brentano. On April 23, 1807, Bettina, 22, came to the aging poet with a letter of introduction from Wieland. She was the granddaughter of Sophia von La Roche, who had loved Wieland, and she was the daughter of Maximiliana Brentano, who had flirted with Goethe. She felt that she had a primogenital lien on Goethe's heart. Soon after entering his room, she flung herself into his arms. He accepted her as a child, and thereafter corresponded with her in that sense, but he enclosed with his letters the latest love poems he had written, and though they were not addressed to her, she treated them as declarations of passion, and gave them that color in the Goethes Briefwechsel mit einem Kinde, Goethe's correspondence with a child, which she published in 1835. Most of the poems had been inspired by Wilhelmina Herzlieb. Minna, as Goethe soon called her, was the daughter of a Jena bookseller. He had known her as a child, but in 1808 she was 19, modest, tender, and blooming. She hung on every word that he spoke, and mourned that age and status forbade her to love and possess him. He perceived her feeling, responded to it, wrote sonnets to her, punning on her name as a loving heart, but he recalled that he had only recently made Christiana his wife. He seems to have had Minna in mind when he portrayed the shy, high-strung, affectionate Ottilia of the Elective Affinities in 1809. This remarkable novel, Die Wahlverwandtschaften, is, as its author thought, his best work of prose fiction, far better organized and more compactly told than either of the Wilhelm Meister circumambulations. Note Goethe's words to Eckermann on February 9, 1829. In the whole of the Elective Affinities there is not a line which I myself did not actually live, and there is far more behind the text than anyone can assimilate at a single reading. Indeed, the fault of the book is that there is too much Goethe in it, too much philosophizing put into unlikely mouths. He makes the girl Ottilia keep a diary in which he deposits some of his maturest obiter cogitata, such as, "Against great excellence in another there is no way of defending ourselves except love." But it is because there is so much of Goethe in this book that it is warm with life and rich in thought, because the Charlotta of the story is again Charlotte von Stein, tempted but refusing to be unfaithful to her husband, because the captain is Goethe in love with his friend's wife, because Edward, the 50-year-old husband infatuated with Ottilia, is Goethe drawn to Minna Herzlieb, and because the novel is Goethe's attempt to analyze his own erotic sensitivity. He here proposed to think of sexual attraction in chemical terms. He may have taken his title from the Elective Affinities published by the great Swedish chemist Torbern Olof Bergman in 1775. The captain describes to Edvard and Charlotta the attractions, repulsions, and combinations of material particles. You ought yourselves to see these substances, which seem so dead and are yet so full of energy and force, at work before your eyes. Now they seek each other out, seize, crush, devour, destroy one another, and then suddenly they reappear in fresh, renovated, unexpected forms. So, when Edvard invites his friend the captain, and Charlotta invites her niece Ottilia to stay with them for long visits, the captain falls in love with Charlotta, and Edvard falls in love with Ottilia. When Edvard has intercourse with his wife, he thinks of Ottilia, and Charlotta thinks of the captain, in a kind of psychological adultery. The offspring looks strangely like Ottilia, and Ottilia takes to the child as if her own. Then, apparently by accident, she lets it drown. In remorse, she starves herself to death. Edvard dies of a broken heart, the captain disappears, Charlotta survives, spiritually dead. A town philosopher concludes, "Marriage is the beginning and end of all civilization. It tames the savage and gives to the most cultivated their best opportunity for gentleness. It should be indissoluble, for it brings so much happiness that its incidental tribulations count for nothing in the scale." 4 pages later, however, one character suggests trial marriage, in which the contract is for only 5 years at a time. In 1810 we find Goethe at Carlsbad taking the waters and flirting with young women, while Christiana, 4 years married, remained at home, flirting with young men. The 61-year-old poet won the passionate love of a darkly beautiful Jewess, Marianne von Eibenberg. Then he fled from her with blonde Sylvia von Siegesar. In a poem addressed to Sylvia, he called her daughter, mistress, darling, white and slim. Christiana sent him appeals for fidelity. And have Bettina and that Frau von Eibenberg arrived in Carlsbad yet? They say here that Sylvia and the Goethers are to be there too. So what will you do between all your flirtations? Rather too many. But you won't forget your oldest one, will you? Think of me a little too now and then. I mean to trust you absolutely, whatever people may say, for you are the only one you know who thinks of me at all. He sent her little gifts. He found time almost every day to compose some poetry or prose. About 1809 he began to write his autobiography. He called it Aus meinem Leben Dichtung und Wahrheit, Fiction and Truth from My Life. The title handsomely admitted that he might now and then, intentionally or not, have mingled imagination with reality. He touched only lightly and delicately on his love for Charlotte Bouffe, but told more fully of his romance with Friederike Brion. Both of these women still lived. He analyzed well and generously many friends of his youth, Lenz, Bazadov, Merck, Herder, Jacobi, Lavater. Of himself he spoke modestly. His private notes complained that the autobiographer is expected to confess his faults but not to reveal his virtues. The book is the history of a mind rather than of a life. Incidents in it are few, reflections abound. It is his greatest book of prose. In 1811 he received from Beethoven a letter of admiration with the overture to Egmont. Poet and composer met at Teplitz in July 1812. Beethoven played for Goethe and took walks with him. If we may trust the novelist August Frankl, wherever they went the people on the promenade respectfully made way for them and saluted them. Goethe, annoyed by these constant interruptions, said, "What a nuisance! I can never avoid this sort of thing." With a smile, Beethoven answered, "Don't let it bother your Excellency. The homage is probably meant for me." Goethe wrote to Zelter, on September 2, 1812, "Beethoven's talent astonished me. His personality, alas, is wholly ungovernable. He is not wrong in finding the world detestable, but this attitude renders it more enjoyable neither to him nor to others. Much of it is to be excused on the deplorable ground that he is losing his hearing." Beethoven's comment on Goethe, "What patience the great man has had with me! What good he has done me!" But the court atmosphere suits him too well. Court appearances and conduct were part of Goethe's official life, for he was still active in administration. His home life had lost its charm. August, 22 in 1812, was an unsalvageable mediocrity, and Christiana was fat and taking to drink. She had some excuse, for his flirtations continued. During his visits to Frankfurt, he often stayed at the suburban villa of Johann von Willemer, and admired Willemer's wife, Marianne. In the summer of 1815 he spent almost 4 weeks with them. Marianne was 31, but she was in the fullness of womanly beauty. She sang Goethe's lyrics and Mozart's arias enchantingly, wrote excellent verse, and exchanged with Goethe a series of poems in imitation of Hafiz, Firdausi, and other Persian bards. Hafiz had been translated into German in 1812. Some of the poems are frankly sensual and tell of mutual joy in physical embraces, but this license may be merely poetic. The three met again in September at Heidelberg. The two poets took long walks together, and Goethe wrote Marianne's name in Arabic letters in the dust around the castle fountain. They never saw each other again after that day, but they corresponded through the 17 remaining years of his life. Willemer seems to have cherished his wife all the more for having charmed so famous a man, and for answering Goethe's verse with poems scarcely inferior to his own. Goethe included hers with his in Westöstlicher Divan, West-Eastern Book of Many Leaves, that he published in 1819. While this correspondence was proceeding in prose and rhyme, Christiana died on June 6, 1816. Goethe noted in his diary, "Her death struggle was dreadful, emptiness and deathly silence within and around me." A profound depression clouded these years, when Charlotte Kestner, the lost beloved of his youth, now the 64-year-old wife of the successful Councillor Kestner of Hanover, visited him with her daughter on September 25, 1816. No emotion seemed to stir in him, and all his talk was courteous triviality. But in 1817 his son August, interrupting a career of dissipation, married Ottilia von Pogwisch. Goethe invited them to live with him. Ottilia brought the gaiety of youth into the household, and soon gave the aging poet grandchildren who made his heart beat again. Ulrike von Levetzow helped. She was one of the 3 daughters of Amalia von Levetzow, whom Goethe had known in Karlsbad. At Marienbad in August 1821 he met Ulrike, who later recalled, "As I had been for some years in a French boarding school at Strasbourg, and was only 17, I had never heard of Goethe, and had no idea that he was a famous man and a great poet. So I wasn't at all shy with the friendly old gentleman. The very next morning he asked me to take a walk with him. He took me along on his walk nearly every morning." He returned to Marienbad in 1822, and all that summer Goethe was very friendly to me. A year later they met in Karlsbad, and soon they stirred the gossip of the spa. By this time the poet had decided that his love was more than paternal. Duke Karl August urged Ulrike to marry Goethe. If she would do this, a fine house would be given to her family in Weimar, and after the poet's death she would receive a pension of $10,000 a year. Mother and daughter refused. Goethe returned desolate to Weimar and drowned his disappointment in ink. Ulrike lived to be 95. In that year, 1821, which led Goethe to Ulrike, Karl Zelter, music director at Jena, brought to him in Weimar a 12-year-old pupil, Felix Mendelssohn. Zelter had opened Goethe's soul to the world of music, and had even taught him to compose. Now the skill of the young pianist astonished and gladdened the old poet, who insisted on having him stay with him for several days. "Every morning," Felix wrote on November 6th, "the author of Faust and Werther kisses me. In the afternoon I play for him, for about 2 hours, partly fugues of Bach, partly my improvisations." On November 8th, Goethe held a reception to introduce Felix to Weimar society. On November 10th, Felix wrote, "Every afternoon he opens the piano and says, 'I have not heard you at all today. Come, make a little noise for me.' Then he sits down next to me and listens. You have no idea how kind and affectionate he is." When Zelter wished to take Felix back to Jena, Goethe persuaded him to let his pupil remain a few days more. "Now," wrote the happy boy, "gratitude to Goethe rose on all sides, and the girls and I kissed his lips and hands. Ottilia von Pogwisch threw her arms around his neck, and since she is very pretty and he flirts with her all the time, the effect was excellent." There are happy moments in history behind the drama of tragedy, notice of historians. 4. The Scientist. Let us go back to his younger years, when, with alert attention and omnivorous interest, he had begun his lifelong pursuit of science. Few of us have known that Goethe devoted more time to scientific investigation and compositions than to all his poetry and prose combined. He had studied medicine and physics at Leipzig, chemistry at Strasbourg. He took up anatomy in 1781, and for years he wandered about Thuringia gathering mineral and botanical specimens and observing geological formations. In his travels he noted not merely men, women, and art, but also fauna and flora, optical and meteorological phenomena. He took a leading part in establishing laboratories in Jena. He rejoiced or grieved as intensely over his victories or defeats in science as over his successes or failures in literature. He did something about the weather. He organized meteorological observation stations in the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar, helped to set up others throughout Germany, and prepared instructions for them. He wrote essays on the theory of weather and the causes of barometric fluctuations. He persuaded Duke Karl August to begin the collections that formed the core of the Museum of Mineralogy at Jena. After studying the geological strata at Ilmenau, he argued that they confirmed Abraham Werner's theory that all the rocky formations on the Earth's crust were the result of the slow action of water. This Neptunist theory has had to be combined with the Vulcanist theory of change by violent action. He was among the first to suggest that the age of strata might be judged from the fossils embedded in them, and to defend the view that the great boulders now erratically distributed in high places had been swept up there by surges of ice coming down from the Arctic zone. In 1791–92, Goethe published in 2 volumes Beiträge zur Optik, Contributions to Optics. "My purpose," he wrote, "has been to assemble all that is known in this field and to undertake all the experiments myself, varying them as much as possible, making them easier to follow, and keeping them within the scope of the ordinary person." During the years from 1790 to 1810, he made numberless experiments to explain color. The Goethe Museum at Weimar still preserves the instruments he used. The result appeared in 1810 in 2 large volumes of text and 1 of plates, entitled Zur Farbenlehre, on the theory of color. This was his major work as a scientist. He studied colors as due not only to the chemical composition of objects, but to the structure and operation of the eye. He analyzed the adaptation of the retina to darkness and light, the physiology of color blindness, the phenomena of color shadows and after-images, the effects of color contrasts and combinations in sensation and in art. He mistakenly thought of green as a blend of yellow and blue. They do blend so on the artist's palette, but when the blue and yellow of the color spectrum combine, they yield gray and white. He repeated many of the experiments described in Newton's Optics of 1704, found in several cases results different from those there reported, and ended by accusing Newton of incompetence and occasional deceit. He opposed Newton's view that white is a composition of colors, and held that their combination regularly produced not white but gray. Neither his contemporaries nor his successors in the field of optics accepted his conclusions. They praised his experiments and discarded many of his theories. In 1815, Arthur Schopenhauer, who admired Goethe as a poet and as a philosopher, sent him an essay ably defending Newton's conception of white as a composition of colors. The old man never forgave him. The general rejection of the Farbenlehre added to the gloom of his final years. A man so sensitive to color as Goethe was could not but be fascinated by the world of plants. At Padua in 1786 he was thrilled by the botanical gardens. Here was a richer and more varied collection than he had ever seen. He saw how different the plants of the South were from those of the North, and he resolved to study the influence of environment upon the form and growth of plants. Nor had he ever felt so deeply the mysterious and overwhelming capacity of nature to develop each form, with its unique pattern of structure, texture, color, and line, out of apparently simple and similar seeds. What fertility and what originality! But were there some common elements in all the diversity of individuals, and in all the evolution of organs and parts? The idea came to him that these genera, species, and varieties were variations of a basic archetype, that all these plants, for example, were formed on some fundamental and original, even if imaginary, model, an Urpflanze, or first plant, the mother of them all. The same law, or theory, he wrote to Herder, will be applicable to all that lives, that is, to animals as well as plants. They too are variations on one structural theme. And as the individual organism with all its uniqueness is an imitation of a primal archetype, so the parts of an organism may be variations of one fundamental form. Goethe noticed in Padua a palmetto whose leaves were in diverse stages of development. He studied the visible transitions from the simplest leaf to the complete majestic fan, and he conceived the idea that all the structures of a plant, except the axis or stem, were variations and stages of the leaf. After his return to Weimar, Goethe published his theory in an 86-page book entitled An Attempt by J. W. von Goethe, privy councillor of the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar to explain the metamorphosis of plants. This in 1790. Botanists laughed at it as the dreams of a poet, and advised the poet to stick to his trade. He took them at their word and rephrased his views in a poem, The Metamorphosis of Plants. Gradually, the theory accumulated evidence and supporters. In 1830, Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire presented Goethe's essay to the French Academy of Sciences as a work of careful research and creative imagination confirmed by the progress of botany. Applying his theory to anatomy, Goethe suggested in 1790 that the skull is a variation and continuation of the vertebrae, enclosing the brain as the spine encloses the spinal cord. There is no agreement today on this conception. One definite and brilliant achievement is credited to Goethe in anatomy, the demonstration of an intermaxillary bone in man. This is the bone between the maxillae or jaw bones that carries the upper incisor teeth. The anatomists had recognized such a bone in animals, but had questioned its existence in man. Goethe's discovery narrowed the structural difference between man and the ape. Here the poet proclaimed his success in a letter from Jena to Charlotte von Stein, March 27, 1784, the lover and the scientist all compact. A few lines to my Lotta by way of saying good morning. I have been granted a delightful satisfaction. I have made an anatomical discovery that is at once beautiful and important. You shall have your share in it, but do not say a word about it. He announced his finding in a manuscript monograph sent to divers scientists in 1784, and entitled, An Attempt Based on Comparative Osteology to Show that the Intermaxillary Bone in the Upper Jaw is common to man and the higher animals. This was the first treatise ever written that can be properly described as lying in the field of comparative anatomy, and thus it is a milestone in the history of this science. The French anatomist Félix Vigdasir published the same discovery in the same year, 1784. In his essay, Goethe wrote, Man is very closely akin to the brute creation. Every creature is only a tone, a modification in a mighty harmony. Like many scientists and philosophers before him, he thought of man as part of the animal kingdom and wrote a poem, The Metamorphosis of Animals. But he was not an evolutionist in the Darwinian sense. Following Linnaeus, he assumed the fixity of species. So his Urpflanze was not an actual primitive plant from which all plants had evolved, but only a general type, of which all plants were modifications. Goethe did not, like his contemporaries Lamarck and Erasmus Darwin, think of species evolving from other species by the environmental selection of favorable variations. Was Goethe a real scientist? Not in the professional sense. He was a zealous and enlightened amateur, a scientist between poems, novels, amours, artistic experiments, and administrative chores. He used extensive equipment, collected a large library of science, made useful observations and careful experiments. Helmholtz testified to the factual accuracy of the objective processes and experiments that Goethe described. He avoided teleological explanations, but he was not accepted as a scientist by professionals, for these looked upon him as a dilettante who depended too trustfully upon intuition and hypothesis. He passed too quickly from one subject or investigation to another, touching each at some special point, and achieving nowhere, except in optics and the theory of color, a survey of the field. But there was something ideal and heroic in his divergent and polymorphous persistence. Said Eckermann in 1825, Goethe will be 80 years old in a few years, but he is not tired of inquiries and experiments. He is always on the track of some great synthesis. And perhaps the poet was right in thinking that the chief aim of science should not be to equip old desires with new tools, but to enlarge wisdom with knowledge for the enlightenment of desire. 5. The Philosopher. As in science, so in philosophy he was a lover, not a professor, though it was he who secured the appointment of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel to chairs of philosophy at Jena. He had very little interest in the debates of the schools, but he was endlessly concerned with the interpretation of nature and the meaning of life. As he became older, he grew through science and poetry into a sage. He found illumination about the whole from every object, moment, and part. Alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gleichnis. Everything transient is but a symbol. The Sprüche in prosa, or accidental apothegms, which he left unprinted at his death, ooze wisdom on every page. He offered no system of logic, but he suggested, pragmatically, that alone is true which is fruitful, and that in the beginning was not the word, but the deed. We find truth in action rather than in thought. Thought should be an instrument, not a substitute for action. He did not take to Kant as Schiller did. He acknowledged that the ultimate nature of reality is beyond our ken, but he did not feel that this committed him to orthodoxy. On the contrary, he recommended ignoring the unknowable. The unfathomable is of no practical value. The perceived world is enough for our lives. He had no epistemological qualms about admitting the existence of an external world. After reading Kant and Schelling, he wrote to Schiller, "I willingly concede that it is not nature in itself that we perceive, but that nature is comprehended by us merely according to certain forms and faculties of our mind. But the appropriateness, or adjustment, of our organic natures to the outer world indicates a determination from without, a relation toward things. Many people resist acknowledging reality only because they would collapse if they accepted it." But Goethe rejected materialism as well as subjectivist idealism. D'Holbach's Système de la Nature appeared to us students at Strasbourg so dark, so death-like, that we found it a trouble to endure its presence and shuddered at it as at a spectre. That was in youth, but in old age he felt likewise, writing to Knebel on April 8, 1812, "A man who does not grasp the fact, nor rise to the vision that spirit and matter, soul and body, thought and extension, are the necessary twin ingredients of the universe, and will forever be, and that these two have equal rights, and may therefore be considered in their togetherness as the representatives of God. He who has not grasped this might as well employ his days with the idle gossip of the world." This, of course, is Spinoza, and Goethe usually follows Spinoza into determinism. We belong to the laws of nature even when we rebel against them. But at times he inclines to agree with Kant that our lives, like the universe to which we belong, are mysteriously composed of freedom and necessity. He felt a force of destiny working in him, of qualities compelling and determining his development, but he cooperated with it, like some free agent serving a cause that moves and includes him. His religion was an adoration of nature and a desire to collaborate with her creative forces, her multiform productivity, and her obstinate perseverance. However, he took long to acquire her patience. He vaguely personified nature, seeing mind and will in her, but a mind quite unlike ours, and a will indifferently neutral as between men and fleas. Nature has no moral feelings in our sense of the obligation of the part to cooperate with the whole, for she is the whole. In the poem Das Göttliche, from 1782, Goethe described nature as without feeling or mercy. She destroys as exuberantly as she makes. "All your ideals shall not prevent me from being genuine and good and bad, like nature." Her only ethic is live and make live. Goethe recognized the need many souls have for supernatural support, but he felt no such need until his final years. He has religion enough who has art or science. He who has not art or science needs religion. As a poet and artist, I am a polytheist, personifying the separate forces of nature, while in my role as scientist I incline to pantheism, seeing one God in everything. Resolutely pagan in religion and morals, he had no sense of sin, felt no need of a God dying to atone for him, and resented all talk of the cross. He wrote to Lavater, August 9, 1782, "I am no anti-Christian, no unchristian, but very decidedly a non-Christian. You accept the gospel as it stands as divine truth. Well, no audible voice from heaven would convince me that a woman bears a child without a man, and that a dead man arises from the grave. I regard all these as blasphemies against God and his revelation of himself in nature." Lavater pressed him, Goethe tells us, and at last came out with the hard dilemma, either Christian or atheist. Upon this I declared that if he would not leave me my own Christianity as I had hitherto cherished it, I could readily decide for atheism, especially as I saw that nobody knew precisely what either term meant. Goethe thought that the Christian religion is an abortive political revolution that turned moral. There are in literature 1,000 pages as beautiful and useful as in the Gospels. Yet I regard all 4 Gospels as quite genuine, for in them is evident the reflected splendor of the sublime power which emanated from the person of Christ and his nature, which was as divine as ever the divine has appeared on earth. I bow before him as a divine manifestation of the highest principle of morality. But he proposed to worship the Son as much as Christ, as equally a manifestation of divine power. He admired Luther and praised the Reformation for breaking the shackles of tradition, but he regretted its relapse into dogma. He suspected that Protestantism would suffer for lack of inspiring, habit-forming ceremonies, and he thought Catholicism wise and beneficent in symbolizing spiritual relations and developments with impressive sacraments. Goethe's views on immorality were a function of his years. On February 2, 1789, he wrote to Friedrich zu Stolberg, "For my own part, I cling more or less to the teachings of Lucretius, and confine myself and all my hopes to this life." But on February 25, 1824, he told Eckermann, "I would by no means dispense with the happiness of believing in a future existence, and indeed I would say with Lorenzo de' Medici that those who hope for no other life are dead even in this one." And on February 4, 1825, "I hold the firm conviction that our spirit is something altogether indestructible." He read Swedenborg, accepted the conception of a spirit sphere, and played with hopes of transmigration. He studied the Kabbalah and Pico della Mirandola, and even drew an occasional horoscope. More and more as he aged, he admitted the rights of faith. "Strictly speaking, I can have no knowledge of God except such as I derive from the limited vision of my sensory perceptions on this single planet. Such knowledge is a fragment of a fragment. I do not admit that this limitation, which is applicable to our observation of nature, need be applicable in the exercise of faith. The contrary is the case. It may well be that our knowledge, necessarily imperfect, demands supplementation and perfecting through an act of faith." In 18 he had written the rebellious Prometheus in his youth, for the young radicals of the day were quoting it against him. He turned away from Fichte when Fichte was accused of atheism. It is our duty, he now held, to tell others no more than they are able to receive. Man grasps only what is to his measure. Like his views of religion, his conception of morality changed with age. Bouncing with youthful energy and pride, he had interpreted life as purely a theater for self-development and display. This craving to raise as high as possible the pyramid of my life, the base of which has been given and established for me, outweighs all else and scarcely permits of a moment's relapse. We have seen him hurting some tender souls in this process. As he matured through political office, he perceived that human life is a cooperative process, that the individual survives by mutual aid, and that self-seeking actions, though still the basic force, must be limited by the needs of the group. Faust, in Part 1, is individualism incarnate. In Part 2, he finds salvation, health of soul, through working for the general good. Wilhelm Meister, in the Lehrjahre, seeks to educate and develop himself, though by nature and training he often aids his fellow men. In the Wanderjahre, he seeks to further the happiness of the community. Goethe balked at the behest to love one's enemies, but he defined nobility nobly in one of his greatest poems. "Let man be noble, helpful and good, for that alone marks him off from all beings that we know. Quite unfeeling is nature, the sun shines upon the base and the good, and upon the lawbreaker gleam as upon the best the moon and the stars. Winds and streams, thunder and hail, roar on their way and snatch up and sweep before them one after another. By eternal iron-clad great laws must we all, of our existence, fulfill the round. But man alone can do the impossible. He distinguishes, chooses, and judges. He can to the fleeting moment give duration. He alone can reward the good, punish the bad, heal and save, and to the erring and straying bring wise counsel. Let the noble man be helpful and good. To become noble, one must beware of debasing influences, and all is influence except ourselves. Never mind studying contemporaries and those who strive with you. Study the great men of the past, whose works have maintained their value and stature for centuries. A truly gifted man will naturally so incline, and the desire to delve into the great precursors is the very mark of a higher endowment. Reverence libraries as the heritage left by these men. Contemplating a library, one feels as though in the presence of vast capital silently yielding incalculable interest. But intellect without character is far worse than character without intellect. Intellect that liberates the mind without giving us dominion over ourselves is pernicious. Plan your living, gedenke zu leben, but seek a balance between thought and action. Thought without action is a disease. To know and practice a craft lends greater culture than half-knowledge 100 times over. No blessing is equal to the blessings of work. Above all, be a whole or join a whole. Only mankind is the true man, and the individual can be joyous and happy only when he has the courage to feel himself in the whole. So the young man who inherited comfort and security and set the Strasbourg students laughing at his rich and fancy dress, learned, through the philosophers, the saints, and the experience of life, to think kindly of the poor, and to wish that the fortunate would share their wealth more generously. Nobles should be taxed in proportion to their income, and should let their dependents benefit from the advantages which expanding knowledge and prosperity are bringing. Even after attaining European fame, Goethe felt the bourgeois' envy of noble birth. In Germany, no one except a nobleman has an opportunity for acquiring a well-rounded personal culture. He observed all the usual obeisances in his behavior toward his superiors. Everyone knows the story of Goethe and Beethoven at Teplitz, July 1812, but its sole source is the unreliable Bettina Brentano von Arnim, who claimed to be quoting Beethoven's account. Kings and princes can indeed bestow titles and orders, but they cannot make great men, who therefore must be held in respect. When two come together, such as Goethe and I, then these high-born gentlemen must observe what it is that counts for great with such as we. Yesterday we met the whole imperial family of Austria, and Goethe disengaged himself from my arm in order to stand aside. I pressed my hat down on my head and went through the thickest of the crowd with my arms hanging at my sides. Princes and courtiers drew up in a double line. The Duke of Weimar took his hat off to me, and the Empress greeted me first. Much to my amusement, I saw the procession file by Goethe, who stood at one side, bowing with his hat in his hand. I took him roundly to task for it afterward. Our reaction to this story will vary with our age. Goethe felt that an aristocracy functioning actively and with public spirit provided the best government then possible in Europe, and deserved the respect required for social order and control. Abuses should be reformed, but without violence or precipitancy. Revolutions cost more than they are worth, and usually end where they began. So Mephistopheles to Faust, "Alack, away, forbear of yonder squabble 'twixt tyranny and slavery to Babel. It irks me, scarce 'tis ended when de novo, with the whole farce they start ab ovo." And so Goethe to Eckermann in 1824. It is quite true that I was no friend of the French Revolution. Its horrors were too immediate, while its beneficial effects were not yet visible. But I was just as little a friend of the arbitrary rule that had preceded it. I was convinced even then that no revolution is the fault of the people, but always the fault of the government. He welcomed Napoleon as a boon to order in France and Europe after a decade of convulsions. He distrusted democracy, for nothing is worse than active ignorance, and it is unthinkable that wisdom should ever be popular. He laughed at the oscillation of power between parties. In politics, as on a sickbed, men toss from side to side in the hope of lying more comfortably. He opposed freedom of the press on the ground that it subjected society and government to perpetual disturbance by immature and irresponsible writers. The cry for freedom seemed to him, in his declining years, to be merely the hunger of the unplaced for power and plums. The sole object is for power, influence, and fortune to pass from one hand to the next. Freedom is the whispered password of secret conspirators, the clamorous battle-cry of the avowed revolutionary, indeed the slogan of despotism itself as it leads its subjugated masses forward against the foe, promising surcease from external oppression for all time. Goethe fulfilled to the maximum the obligation of the old to serve as a brake upon the energy of the young. 6. Faust, Part 2. He poured his aging philosophy into Part 2 of Faust. At the end of Part 1 he had left his alter ego, broken and desolate, in the power of Mephistopheles, desire punished for its excess. But could that be all, and the sum of wisdom? Faust had not quite lost his wager. The devil had not yet found for him any delight that could calm his striving and fill his life. Was there anywhere such a fulfillment? Through 24 years Goethe struggled to find for the story a continuation and a culmination that should contain or symbolize the conclusions of his thought, and should give to his hero a noble and inspiring end. At last, aged 78, he faced the task. On May 24th, 1827, he wrote to Zelter, who had grown old with him and was to die with him, "I want quietly to confess to you that I have gone to work at Faust again. Tell no one." The dramatic finale of Byron in the Greek War of Liberation had stirred Goethe. Now he could make Byron, as Euphorion, or well-being, son of Faust and Helen, represent the healing of the torn and questioning modern mind, through union with the calm beauty of classic Greece. He labored in the morning hours, achieving at best a page a day, until, in August of 1831, 7 months before his death, he announced to Eckermann that the consuming task was complete, 59 years after its first conception. "The happiest man," he had written, "is he who is able to integrate the end of his life with its beginning. And now," he said, "whatever of life remains to me I can regard henceforth as a gift, and it does not really matter whether I accomplish anything more or not." Only in the assurance of 80 years can one take time to read all of Faust Part 2 today. From the opening scene, in which Faust, awakening in spring fields, describes the sunrise with no word-worn eloquence, the action repeatedly stops for lyric paeans to nature's beauty or grandeur or terror. It is well done, but too often. Goethe, preaching classic restraint, here sins against nothing too much. He poured into the drama almost everything that cluttered his teeming memory. Greek and German mythologies, Leda and the Swan, Helen and her train, witches and knights and fairies and gnomes, griffins and pygmies, dryads and sirens, dissertations on Neptunian geology, long speeches by heralds, flower girls, garden nymphs, woodcutters, punchinellos, drunkards, pages, seneschals, wardens, a charioteer and a sphinx, an astrologer and an emperor, fauns and philosophers, the cranes of Ibycus, and a little man, homunculus, chemically created by Faust's pupil Wagner. The farrago is more confusing than a tropical jungle, for it adds the supernatural to the natural and endows everything with oratory or song. What a comfort it is when, in Act 3, Helen appears, still miraculously Dia Gynaikon, goddess among women, conquering men with the grace of her movement or the glance of her eyes. The story takes on new force, and the chorus rises to a Sophoclean tone when Helen hears that Menelaus, as punishment for beauty insolently bold, has ordered her and her attendant women to be surrendered to the lusts of a barbarian horde invading Hellas from the north. Their leader is Faust himself, transformed by Mephistophelian art into a medieval knight, handsome in figure, face, and garb. Goethe reaches the apex of his dramatic art as he describes the meeting of Helen and Faust, classic Greece confronting medieval Germany. Let these two unite. That is the burden of the tale. Faust, enthralled like all men, lays at Helen's feet all the wealth and power that magic and war have given him. She yields herself to his entreaties. After all, this was hardly a fate worse than death. But Menelaus approaches with his army and interrupts their bliss. Faust turns in a trice from love to war, calls his men to arms, and leads them to the conquest of Sparta, a memory of the Franks conquering the Morea in the 13th century. The scene changes. Years have flown by. Euphorion is a happy youth, gladdening Faust and Helen with caresses, playful banter, sportive calls. leaping recklessly from cliff to cliff, gently cautioned by his parents, dancing wildly with nymphs entranced by his charm. Byron in Italy. He seizes one of them rapturously, only to have her burst into flame in his arms. Hearing with welcome the tocsin of war, he rushes off, falls from a precipice, and, dying, summons his mother to join him in the nether-world. Helen, to Faust. Woe is me! An ancient adage proves on me its truth, that fortune weds with beauty never abidingly. Asunder rent the bond of life is, as of love, and both bewailing, anguished, I say farewell, upon thy bosom casting me yet once again. Receive, Persephone, the child and me. She embraces Faust, her corporeal part vanishes, robes and veil remain in his arms. So ends the third and finest act of this second Faust. This was the part that Goethe wrote first, which he called Helena, and which for a time he thought of as a separate and finished whole. He might have done well to leave it so. Here, by some heroic draught upon his surviving powers, Goethe rose for the last time to the peak of his poetry, mingling drama with music as in Periclean days, and raising to life and blood the figures of a complex allegory for the healing of the modern mind. From that height, Faust, too, slips down to a war between an emperor and a contender for the Holy Roman throne. Faust and Mephistopheles, using their magic arts, win the war for the emperor. Faust asks and receives, as reward, great stretches of the empire's northern coast, with such land as he can wrest from the sea. In Act 5, Faust, 100 years old, is master of a vast domain, but not yet of himself. The cottage of a peasant couple, Philemon and Baucis, obstructs the view from his mansion. He offers them a better home elsewhere. They refuse. He asks Mephistopheles and his agents to drive them out. Meeting resistance, they set fire to the cottage. The old couple die of fright. Faust is soon haunted by visions of avenging furies, grey hags named Want, Guilt, Care, Need, and Death. Care breathes into his face and blinds him. A partly unselfish thought raises him out of despair. He orders Mephistopheles and his devils to dike the sea, drain the swamps, and build on the new land 1,000 homes amid green fields. He visions this reclaimed terrain and feels that if he could, with a free people, stand on a free soil, he would at last say to such a moment, "Tarry a while, thou art so fair." He hears the sounds of picks and spades and thinks that his grand design is progressing. Actually, the devils are digging his grave. Exhausted, he falls dying to the ground. Mephistopheles gloats over him as a horde of devils prepares to take Faust's soul to hell. But a host of angels swoops down from heaven, and while Mephistopheles is distracted with admiration of their legs, they bear aloft the mortal remains of Faust. In heaven, Faust, new-clothed in a transfigured body, is greeted by a glorified Gretchen, who begs the Virgin Mother, "Grant me to teach him." The Virgin bids her lead him upward, and a chorus mysticus ends the play. Everything transitory is only a symbol. The ever unfinished here is completed. The indescribable is here accomplished. The eternal womanly draws us upward and on. 7. Fulfillment, 1825 to 1832. In 1823, Johann Peter Eckermann, aged 31, became Goethe's secretary and began to note the old man's conversation for posterity. The resultant Gespräche mit Goethe, 3 volumes, 1836 to 1848, partly revised by Goethe, contains more wisdom than is to be found in most philosophers. In September 1825, Weimar celebrated the semi-centennial of Karl August's accession. Goethe attended the ceremony. The Duke grasped his hand and murmured to him, "Together to the last breath." On November 7th, the court celebrated the 50th anniversary of Goethe's coming to Weimar, and the Duke sent him a letter which was also made a public proclamation. With profound pleasure I would mark the 50th return of this day as the jubilee not only of the premier servant of my state, but of the friend of my youth, who has accompanied me through all the mutability of life with unchanged affection, loyalty, and steadfastness. I owe the happy outcome of my most important undertakings to his circumspect counsel, his ever-living sympathy and beneficent service. To have attached him permanently to myself I regard as one of the highest ornaments of my reign. Now came those sadly aging years when friend after friend disappears. On August 26, 1826, 2 days before Goethe's 77th birthday, Charlotte von Stein, 84 years old, sent her last known letter to her lover of half a century before. All my best wishes and blessings on this day. May the guardian angels in the heavenly parliament command that all that is good or beautiful be granted to you, my very dear friend. I continue to remain yours in hope and without fear, while I beg of you for myself your freely given kindness during the brief span that remains to me. She died on January 6, 1827. Hearing of it, Goethe wept. On June 15, 1828, the Duke died, and Weimar knew that its golden age was ending. Goethe prepared for his turn by working feverishly on Faust. But he was not next in line. His only surviving child, August, after 40 years of failure, 20 of dissipation, died in Rome, October 27, 1830. A post-mortem showed a liver 5 times the normal size. When the news was brought to Goethe, he said, "I was not unaware that I had begotten a mortal." "I tried to absorb myself in work," he wrote. "I forced myself to continue Volume 4 of Poetry and Truth." At 80, he began to narrow his interests. In 1829, he stopped reading newspapers. "I can't begin to tell you," he wrote to Zelter, "the time I have gained and the things I have accomplished during the 6 weeks that I have left all French and German papers unopened. Fortunate is he whose world lies in his home." He enjoyed love and care from August's widow, Ottilia, and he took delight in her children. Sometimes, however, he withdrew even from them and sought full privacy, praising solitude as the nurse and test of a well-furnished mind. His face now showed its 80 years, deep wrinkles across the forehead and around the mouth, silver hair receding, eyes quiet and wondering, but his stature was erect and his health was good. He prided himself on having avoided coffee and tobacco, both of which he condemned as poisons. He was vain of his looks and his books, honestly relished praise, gave it frugally. When in 1830 a young poet sent him a volume of verse, Goethe acknowledged it caustically. "I have glanced through your little book. Since, however, in an epidemic of cholera one must protect oneself against weakening influences, I have laid it aside." Mediocrity offended him. He grew more and more irritable as the years threw him back into himself, and he admitted as much. "Everyone who, judging by my work, considered me amiable, found himself greatly deceived when he came in contact with a man of coldness and reserve." Visitors described him as slow to thaw, a bit formal and stiff, perhaps out of embarrassment, or grudging time taken from his tasks. Yet many of his letters showed tenderness and consideration. He was now famous throughout Europe. Carlyle acclaimed him, long before Goethe's death, as one of the great figures in world literature. Byron dedicated Werner to him. Berlioz dedicated The Damnation of Faust to Monseigneur Goethe. Kings sent him gifts. But in Germany his reading public was small, the critics were hostile, his rivals belittled him as a pompous counselor affecting to be a poet and a scientist. Lessing condemned Goethe and Werther as romantic trash. Klopstock scorned Hermann und Dorothea as commonplace, and Iphigenia as a stiff imitation of the Greeks. Goethe reacted with repeated expressions of contempt for Germany, for its climate, scenery, history, language, and mind. He complained that he had to write in German, and therefore squandered life and art on the worst material. He told his friends that these fools of Germans had quite deserved their defeat by Napoleon at Jena, and Germany had the laugh on him when the Allies overcame Bonaparte at Waterloo. Detached from the main, romantic, stream of literature in his old age, he consoled himself with deepened contempt of the world and man. Viewed from the heights of reason, all life looks like some malignant disease, and the world like a madhouse. A few days ago, he wrote to Zelter, on March 26, 1816, I came upon a copy of the first edition of Werther, and that long-silenced song began to rise again. It was hard for me to understand how a man could endure the world for 40 years when he had seen its absurdity even in his youth. And he looked for no substantial betterment in the future. Men exist only to trouble and kill one another. So was it, so is it, so will it ever be. Like most of us after 60, he thought that the new generation was degenerate. The incredible arrogance in which the young are growing up will show its results in a few years in the greatest follies. Yet much is stirring that in after years may be cause for rejoicing. On March 15, 1832, he caught a cold while out driving. On the 18th he seemed recovered, but on the 20th the infection had sunk into his chest, catarrhal fever consumed him, and his face was distorted with pain. On the 22nd he noted that spring had begun. Perhaps this will help me to get well. The room had been darkened to ease his eyes. He protested, "Let in more light." Still oppressed by the gloom, he ordered his valet, "Open the blind of the other window so that more light may come in." These were apparently his last words. He had asked Ottilia, "Little woman, give me your little paw." He died in her arms and holding her hand, at noon, March 22, 1832, aged 82 years and 7 months. Eckermann saw the corpse on the next day. The body lay naked, wrapped only in a white sheet. The valet drew aside the sheet, and I was astonished at the godlike magnificence of the limbs. The breast was powerful, broad, and arched. The arms and thighs were full and softly muscular. The feet were elegant and of the most perfect shape. Nowhere on the whole body was there a trace either of fat or of leanness or decay. A perfect man lay in great beauty before me, and the rapture which the sight caused me made me forget for a moment that the immortal spirit had left this abode.